Welcome to the party, pal. Your friendly neighborhood master chaos here. I hope you're well. Today I have a very special guest with me. We've been diving into the Doris Wishman box sets, into the great white world of Wishman ephemera. We're going to talk to the expert, the genre expert, the man who has spent probably the most time with her, really learning about her filmmaking, learning about who she is as a person. So we're not just going to be talking about, the dry facts of the movies, all that stuff. We're going to be talking about who she was, why she made these movies, and was she certifiably insane. We'll find all that out. I do want to give you a heads up. Pardon me, I'm fighting a cold, but the show must go on. I'll do my best to mute my mic. Michael will do most of the talking because you're here to listen to him and not me. So without further ado, let me tell you where you're at, and we'll get right to it.
Hail to the king, baby.
Hello, motherfucker.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Michael Bowen. How are you, Michael?
I'm doing fine. How are you, Jose?
Oh, I am excited, and I'm very happy to reunite with you. It's been a long time. Maybe
20 years ago.
Yeah.
Since we met making Doris's last film.
Doris's last film. I mean, to me, I hold it as a badge of honor that I was there.
You should.
It's amazing. I mean, it's so amazing. I remember Linnea Quigley, who's in the movie a little bit. She says, "Oh, I'm gonna be in this Doris Wishman movie." I'm like, "Wait a minute, what? The Doris Wishman?" And she's like, "Oh yeah, she's making a movie." I go, "Oh my god, I thought she was dead. Holy shit, get me on that. I'll do anything."
Yeah.
And that's how it happened. That's how we united initially. And you were kind of everything, producer, all kind of doing a whole bunch of stuff on that.
Yeah, I would call myself the line producer. I had been working with Doris on live appearances and various deals and things like that. And then an angel investor came along and offered to put up a modest amount of money that seemed like a lot of money at the time, and made it possible for her to try to shoot this film. So I agreed to sign on as the guy who would make sure the movie got finished. I don't know that Doris ever had anybody like that working with her before, and it was a great experience for me, both because I had never made a movie before. I have no real background in filmmaking. I'm a movie buff and a film historian. But I guess I had absorbed enough from my conversations with people in the 60s exploitation world to have some sense of how a cockamamie one-lung production was filmed. And then I just, slept 3 hours a night and did my best to keep things going. The truth is, if you asked me to do it again, I'd say no. Not that I wouldn't produce another movie for Doris again, but when I think about how complicated that script was, particularly relative to her films like from the 60s, that was like 5 times the movie she usually made. And I'm running around trying to secure 20 different locations and keep dozens of actors and extras on board. I mean, Doris has made some movies that probably had 5 people in them and they were shot in 3 rooms. I should have, if I had thought about it, I should have said, where's the script we can shoot Doris where you only have, 5 people in 3 rooms? But I learned a lot. I got to spend a great deal of time with Doris seeing how she worked, firsthand experience of how she worked. So that was a big motivation for me. And it was a real adventure. And you were a tremendous help too. And everybody who worked on that film. I'm glad we did it because we can all say we survived to tell the tale, right?
Absolutely. I think my main curiosity coming on board was, how did this woman make movies? What is her directing style? So coming on and seeing her, I was fresh out of film school. I had made a movie, but it was shot on video kind of thing. And I was about to go on to my 35 millimeter movie. So I was I'm so curious how this woman, this exploitation icon makes movies. And just to see her directing, I was like, wow, she's made how many movies? I mean,
I mean, she's been involved in the production of 30 feature films. There are reasons to count up to 30, although some of them she only has partial participation or had a kind of unusual, irregular relationship with the film. Like she remade films and, cut up films and added junk. but certainly a couple dozen features that she also technically wrote, although, her very few of her films actually had complete screenplays.
Right.
So her writing sort of happened while the camera was rolling, but she was completely in control of the situations, the ultimate dialogue, etc. So we can't say she wrote them, but they were written in a non-traditional way. And I agree. For me, having hooked up with her a few years earlier and become a huge fan of her films and having hatched this desire at the time to write a book about her, I said this will be a completely unique opportunity to get a sense of how she does her thing, and also to maybe make a judgment about whether or not she actually knew what she was doing. I mean, I think if Doris has this reputation, right, for being somebody who makes these crackpot movies that, according to some people's taste, classifies some of the worst movies ever made, the female Ed Wood, that kind of thing. But it struck me right off the bat when I first found her films in those early Something Weird video releases on videotape back then, that there was something very consistent about the films. It wasn't like somebody who had no idea how to make a movie made some half-assed movie that sort of falls apart all over the place, and they never made another one because they didn't know what the hell they were doing. She made movie after movie after movie, and although they were made in a kind of a inside-out, upside-down fashion relative to, contemporary standard filmmaking technique, there was a great deal of stylistic consistency. I bet you'd agree. You can recognize a Doris Wishman movie in 4 minutes. You watch a Doris Wishman movie in 4 minutes, and not many directors can claim to have styles that are that robust. So what I learned from the film is that she did know what she was doing. It's just that she doesn't do things the way normal, regular, standard filmmakers would. But she had very clear ideas about what she wanted, and God rest her soul, she died just before we tried to get the film edited. And really, a lot of Wishman magic happens during that editing phase. She's very hands-on.
I would assume so. I mean, I just shotgunned like 15 of her movies, for the reviews, and they all almost feel like the same thing. There's so many similar things, like they run together. Like, wait, which was the movie with the lingerie girls? Oh wait, there were all the lingerie girls in every movie. So there's a lot of that. But
there are obviously diegetic consistencies like that because she was working, in certain genres. Doris had a very limited opportunity to make movies. If we look at the history of filmmaking, particularly, let's look at it in the context of the 60s. Hardly anybody made movies at that time. Nowadays, with digital video, etc., virtually everybody is a filmmaker. I mean, we're making a movie right now, in a sense, right? But in the 60s, particularly if you're talking about 35 millimeter production, it was the tiniest group of people who did that. And just even knowing, what lenses to rent, to go with an Arriflex camera. I mean, it was a much smaller world. You know what I mean? So, and the exhibition opportunities were much more limited. You're talking about exclusively exhibiting in movie theaters, real world movie theaters, with real 35 millimeter projectors and buying tickets at the box office. It wasn't kind of like, oh, we'll make this and maybe we'll stream it or sell DVDs on the side. But you either had to show them in a movie theater or you were shite out of luck, as they say. So Doris had a very limited opportunity, and she recognized that the best way to guarantee her ability to make films was to work in genres. So she stuck pretty rigidly to a couple of different genres, knowing there was a market for those. And by market, I mean that distributors, the money people, would give her money when the film was done. Whether there was an audience, a paying audience at the box office, that was the distributor's problem, not Doris's. But as long as the distributors felt that they could make money with her films, they gave her money. So, there's that consistency because she tried to stick with certain types of genre formulas, although she also violates them in 1,000 ways. I mean, most of her sexploitation movies have female protagonists. Like that, go check out most of the 60s sexploitation. It's all about men, right? There are those issues where she does, again, everything backwards because she doesn't recognize that she's probably supposed to have men as the protagonists, right? But also the thing that strikes me, though, is consistent in her films is that formally, the way she edits the films, the way she instructs her camera people to shoot the films. I mean, there are some things that are just byproducts of sheer poverty, right? Doris made a joke once when I was working with her in those late days, of her life, and she was sort of being rediscovered by younger people. She said to me, "Michael, everyone keeps asking me about my style," and I said, "What do you mean, the lack of money style?" Because clearly there are elements that relate to the fact that there's almost no money. Her longtime cameraman Chuck Smith, whom you'll remember very well, Jose, because he worked with us on that last film. But he shot many of her films in the 60s and 70s, more than half of them. And he used to tell me I'd show up with a camera and a lens and 2 lights, and that's what you got. And it wasn't even really that he was like, "Oh, this is a crappy movie, I'm not going to waste my time." Like, there was no money. But, anybody, again, who watches those movies will see that Chuck never really cut corners given the limitations that he had. He always tried to do something interesting. Handheld camera work and little lighting, little, whatever he could do. He didn't just say, "Oh, this movie's a piece of junk, I'll give her nothing," right? So she always managed to get the best out of people, and yet, and still at the end of the day, she put together something that was Doris Wishman. I would say almost all the time, there are very few films that feel a little wishy-washy. Like, is this Doris? She clearly had a vision. So anybody, who's watching this who hasn't seen a number of them, go check them out, and I think you'll see right away what we're talking about. You're watching a Doris Wishman movie. I used to joke that you're watching a Doris Wishman movie. It's kind of like, what was that show years ago? Name That Tune. I can name that tune in 7 notes or something, right? You can recognize a Doris Wishman movie before you can recognize an Orson Welles movie.
Yeah.
not too many people can make a claim like that. And I think whether you like the films or not, there's something to that. You should think about that. How did she develop such a distinct, robust style, particularly, working against the grain like that? So anyway.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I remember Chuck very well. He became a dear friend. He was actually at our wedding.
Yep.
Yeah, no, he was
lovely guy.
Miss him dearly. I think just a few days ago was 5 years since we lost him. So amazing guy.
He was a wonderful guy and came out of retirement essentially to shoot this film. It was a lot of work for a guy who he was in his 70s at that time.
Something like that, yeah.
A lot of work for a guy at that age, but Chuck, was eternally youthful, and it wasn't all fun. It wasn't always fun to work with Doris. I don't want to whitewash it, She certainly wasn't a tyrant, like these tyrannical directors. But
no,
it could be frustrating because you weren't quite sure what she wanted. She couldn't always communicate it. Since she did things in a kind of unconventional way, everybody, I'm sure you experienced this, Jose, was running around trying to figure out what she needed and trying to help and then it turned out that, what you wanted was the opposite of what you did. And what you did was totally common sense, right?
Yeah.
You're like, okay, I just wasted all this time doing the obvious thing that anybody would do, and you don't want it. So there were some rough spots.
Yeah.
But all in all, it was a priceless experience for me, and I think everybody who worked on it will certainly never forget it. Even some of the college students who are extras, I'm sure they occasionally sit around and go, "Remember that crazy lady who made that movie?" And Doris was 90 years old when you met her.
Oh wow!
And I'm sure you can testify to the fact that she was running circles around young guys like you.
Well, she wasn't just sitting around. She was very active, for
we
sure.
ran out of steam before she did. She would have shot all night. I used to say, "Doris, I got to go home and sleep for 4 hours."
Yeah.
endless energy. You can testify to that as well. She was
absolutely
amazing, and she loved making movies. I'll say maybe this one last thing, and maybe you have some specific questions you want to ask. But a lot of people think that people who worked in exploitation movies were very jaded and cynical, and it was just a way to make a fast buck. I remember a lot of people making claims like that, and there could have been some people who operated that way. But Doris was completely sincere, loved filmmaking, lived for it, died with virtually no money. So, this notion that somehow she got rich by making these cheap movies, no. Doris was paying her rent and managing to cobble together enough seed money to get the next film going, and that was her life. She never made a fortune, and she didn't think, "Oh, I'll make stupid movies for for idiots." She loved every movie she made, was very sincere about every movie, tried her. She used to say, "My movies are made with Mishman blood," and people would kind of laugh, but she really sweated to make the best film she could with almost no money. It's absolutely true. So you can think you could do better. I always tell people, occasionally hear people deride her films. I'll say, go ahead, you go do better. And make something, by the way, while you're doing better. Make something that's completely stylistically distinct and that all kinds of people around the world really enjoy decades and decades and decades after she did it. You go ahead and do that. Come back to me in 50 years and we'll talk.
There you go. There you go. She absolutely grew up in I grew up, but she flourished in a time where cinema was so special, and she carved a niche. Absolutely. We got some questions in the chat, so let's go to that real quick. Sunset Shimmer says, I would love it if they did release a set of her last films. I really want to see Each Time I Kill because MC was a PA. That is correct. What happened? How come that never got out?
Sure, Alex, it's very simple, and it might be my mistake to some extent, might be my fault. Well, first of all, the big reason the film wasn't released is because Doris was hospitalized with terminal cancer, right within a couple of weeks after we finished shooting the film. And Jose, you can testify to the fact that nobody working on that movie would have thought this lady is dying of cancer.
No.
She had been diagnosed with lymphoma, and shortly after the film was finished, her oncologist said, okay, well, look, this is spreading like crazy, and so you either have to go get chemotherapy or you're going to die very soon. So Doris, figured, well, might as well try the chemo, right? Everybody wants to live a couple extra weeks, it turns out, right? So she tried the chemo, and this isn't a medical opinion, but I guess I'll say casually that the chemo killed her. Her immune system collapsed. She got pneumonia. Her kidneys failed. She was too old to withstand the kind of assault that does on your body. I'm not an expert on it, but that, she lied to me when she went to the hospital. I'm calling her from New York because I was living in New York at that time. I spent that 6 weeks in Florida shooting the film, and I'm calling her to see if she's going to start editing. We had an editor standing by. I was waiting for her for a week. She wasn't showing up. She said, Michael, I'm in the hospital. I hurt my neck. I said, oh, you did, huh? Yeah. And I'm calling her again. Don't think this sounds right. So I flew down to Florida and I go to the hospital where she tells me she's in the oncology ward, right? Which is cancer for people who don't know fancy medical terminology. And I said, so you hurt your neck, huh? And she said, Michael, I'm never getting out of here. So I hung with her, and I stayed there several days. And then finally had to go back to New York. And a couple days after I got back, she passed on. But she was sort of beyond, you couldn't really talk to her by the time I left. But I went to the hospital every day. And it was wonderful to be with her in those last days. But when she died, we had no real opportunity to edit the film unless we tried to edit it ourselves. And believe me, an effort was made on a few occasions. And then we were in a kind of a quandary because it's like, well, do we want to do this kind of like pastiche of Doris Wishman style, like kind of, yuck it up and make it look very Doris, but that didn't seem authentic because we didn't really know what she would want to do. You know what I mean? Very hard to know. And sound mixing and dubbing, all of that stuff. She was so intimately involved in it, and it's so much a part of what makes a movie a Doris Wishman movie. So the effort was made, and at the end of the day, a cut of the film was completed. There is a cut of the film that the executive producer, the fellow who very generously put up all the money, he arranged to finally get that completed. But it didn't get formally released because I got this brilliant idea when we were in pre-production that we could get a lot of buzz if we got a couple of well-known people to agree to be in the movie. Like John Waters, who was a fan of some of Doris's work and met Doris and really wanted to he was very generous in promoting her work. So we asked him if he would be willing to do, a small cameo. Also Fred Schneider, for people who know 70s new wave music, the lead singer of the B-52s, was a fan of Doris's. He had titled the B-52's greatest hit set Nude on the Moon. So we sought him out, became friends with him, very generously agreed to be in the movie. Linnea Quigley, whom you mentioned, famous Scream Queen. She was living in that area. We're delighted to work with her. She was so lovely to work with. We got this notion that we should do this, but we were told right away, look, I'm in the Screen Actors Guild, right? John Waters said, I'm in SAG, so I can't be in a movie that doesn't have a Screen Actors Guild contract. And I said, well, okay. And I called up Screen Actors Guild, and they said, sure, you can do an experimental film. You don't have to pay the actors what they would normally be paid. But then if you ever release it commercially, then you get kicked up to a professional contract and you have to pay them a whole bunch of money. So I thought, oh, well, whatever. We'll figure that out. This was my level of experience. Right? And so while we were at it, we needed a whole bunch of grown-ups to be in the movie. The film focused on teenagers, but they all had parents in the script. So I said, well, as long as we're organized as a SAG film, let's just reach out to the SAG community in Florida. We'll get a bunch of professional actors to be in the movie, and we'll pay them off someday. At any rate, the executive producer who owns the film, right, and who has all the liability, said, the cost of this is crazy. We can't afford to pay these people to release the film commercially. So I do understand that there are some bootlegs floating around out there that people might be able to find. And I know even in the past year, a modest effort was made to figure out if the film could finally be released and to resolve these contractual issues. But to date, that hasn't happened. So that might be a long-winded way of explaining why her last film, Each Time I Kill, is not available, on a regular basis. I think it's a wonderful artifact, and it would be great. But that I hope that explains the situation. It's just like other films that were underground movies that had music rights issues because they're full of, Elvis Presley music and stuff. And then one day somebody said, hey, you got to pay a lot of money for these rights. So it turned out to be a matter of having to pay the actors, who deserve whatever they could get, by the way. But, given the relative likely income from the film, the limited, it didn't seem possible. Maybe one day, God willing.
One day. Oh, there you go, Sunset Shimmer. That is unfortunately why you may never see it. Maybe one day.
Yeah,
we'll see.
I have heard that bootlegs are kicking around out there. Keep your eyes open if you're good at snooping around online for pirated films or on eBay. I mean, there were DVD screeners of it. I have one. I've never leaked it, but I understand that it's been leaked. So keep your eyes open, guys. It's out there somehow, some way, for sure.
Wink, wink. I will say it's not a great movie. So if you do find it, just keep that in mind. It's not an amazing film, but it is better than Dildo Heaven, which I couldn't finish.
That was another project somebody else produced for her, before this one. And again, I give anybody credit for having seen the merits of working with Doris and giving her the opportunity to try to make a film. I really do. I think anybody who made the effort deserves a tremendous amount of credit. Maybe in some ways the idea to make a last end of life Doris Wishman film was misconceived. I think, lightning doesn't really strike twice. She was working at a certain time in the culture, the 60s and then the 70s, like the Chesty Morgan films. And, there's something about that period, the way people looked, the film stocks, the backgrounds that contribute to a lot to the vibe of those films. So trying to do it again on digital video, although I will say this, we didn't really know how to use that digital video camera. At that time, it was a very high-end camera. Now it would seem like an absolutely ancient, creaky dinosaur, right? But a lot of the footage came out really like the color balance was wrong. There were some crazy-ass things about it that would probably look kind of cool to people now who have grown up in the video age as well. So anyway, keep your eyes open. It's not lost. And I think, as I said, that there are some bootlegs floating around.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions, but I'm going to save those towards the end. What I want to do now is sort of start at the beginning. We started at Each Time I Kill because that's sort of our meeting place. But I think let's go back.
Sure.
Let's go back to the beginning. Well, my first question before we start with her career is, What drew you to Doris? What did you see in her that you're like, oh my God, I want to document this woman's life? What was that like magic?
Sure. I was what people used to call a movie buff. This is going back into the 80s. I mean, I graduated from high school in 1981. I'm getting up there, Jose. And I predate the video era, and I even mean videotape when I say that. So I was going to repertory theaters in the Boston area. I grew up in southern New Hampshire, but a very short drive to get down to Boston, or Cambridge, Mass, where Harvard is. That area. There were a lot of repertory theaters then. They were kind of on the way out, but they were still there. And I saw all the foreign films and the classic Hollywood films and the oddball underground films. I was interested in cinema, although I never made films and I never had any intention of doing so. Just a guy who went to the movies too much. And then video came along, and you'd find some obscurities on videotape. And then I was in a little, it was really a record store, kind of punk oriented. I kind of came up through the punk music scene myself, not as a musician, just as somebody who listened to all that music when I was in high school. And there was this punk music store in the Harvard Square area in Cambridge, Mass. And they put together a video wall, kind of like Kim's Video in New York would do as well, but with a lot of outre, cult films, as they used to call them. And I used to scoop around to see what was in there. And one day I looked, and there was a whole new section of videos, and they all had this very consistent artwork on the boxes. Well, they were Something Weird videos. And they had put together a grab bag of, I don't know, looks like, I'm going to guess they bought 30, 40, 50 videos from Something Weird at a shot. It's the first time I ever heard of Something Weird. This would have been in the 90s. I just started pulling things based on the title, and I grabbed a movie called Bad Girls Go to Hell. I'm like, hey, a movie with that title, that's got to be something interesting, right? And I came home and I put it in my VCR, and I hit play, and it couldn't have been on for more than 5 minutes. And I never sat down. I just kept standing in front of the TV. I think my jaw dropped lower and lower. And I said out loud to nobody, I said, who the hell made this movie? Like I had seen Fellini and Bergman and Antonioni and all of the greats and some of the more obtuse, convoluted stylists from the art cinema, and I had seen underground movies, Kenneth Anger, and that whole scene. I found Bad Girls Go to Hell to be as stylistically miraculous, unexpected, complex, and interesting as any of those films. I was fascinated right away, and to this day, it's still my favorite film. But my love for Wishman was kind of born with it. I'm glad to say I eventually became a distributor of that film. I arranged to have a print struck and used to exhibit it at theaters. Doris would make appearances sometimes along with a couple of her other films because I just thought it was a great. Anyway, I just needed to know who made it because it was clear that whoever made it was a very unusual and interesting individual. And then lo and behold, I can no longer really remember. It was such a short time. I want to say a couple of weeks. It might have been a couple months. After that day, it turns out that the Harvard Film Archive, which was literally almost across the street in some ways from where this video store was, but no connection, which used to do a very complex, repertory program that changed every day. They probably still do, but I haven't lived in that area for a million years. They were going to show Doris Wishman movies, and they invited Doris to come, right? So I couldn't believe it. Like here, I just discovered this filmmaker, and I was at that time working at a repertory theater in Harvard Square, the Brattle Theater. And we used to have a wonderful reciprocal arrangement with other movie theaters. We could give them a call and say, hey, can one of our employees come to see a movie for free at your theater? We'll let you come see a movie for free at our theater. And they were sure. So I got to see a lot of movies for free. So I was friends already with people at Harvard Film Archive and got myself into the screenings. And there's this little tiny lady. Doris, must have been 4'3". That's an exaggeration, but Jose, she was less than 5 feet tall, right?
Yeah.
Little tiny lady with this wonderful kind of wiry gray, I'll say graying. She'd yell at me if I said gray, graying hair. I mean, she was 80 years old at that time, and more than that. And she's sitting there in theater, and they called her up, and she was very embarrassed and had no idea what to do. I mean, she'd never, ever in her life been treated as an auteur filmmaker. And so they said, any questions? And nobody raised their hand because who the hell knew what to ask her? Nobody, right? So I raised my hand and asked her a question. I raised my hand and asked, no one else raised their hand. I raised my hand again. And then because I knew folks at the Film Archive who were hosting her, I got myself introduced to her, and we had a breakfast the next morning at the beautiful, expensive hotel where Harvard put her up. I mean, it must have blown Doris's mind. She's being put up at these 5-star hotels at Harvard. And here, she knew what her movies were. They were low-budget sex films.
Mm-hmm.
She was no pretense. She wasn't trying to do anything sneaky. Like, she wasn't trying to sneak any art in. She just happens to be a kind of like independent outsider genius, I guess is the way. And it totally caught her off guard that anybody gave a darn about those movies. But I met her that morning. We had a lot of fun. She was funny, playful, loved joking around. She loved you insult her, she'd insult you, and everybody laughed. Endlessly energetic, always cooking up new schemes. Michael, I have an idea. Maybe you want to work with me. It was that kind of thing. And I was charmed, and knew I wanted to at least be friends with her for sure. She was an amazing person to know. One of those, the most unforgettable person you ever met in your life kind of people. Doris was that person, So that's how it started. I just started calling her. She was living, as you know, down in South Florida, and I was living in Boston then, and we talked on the phone all the time and cooked up schemes. And I gradually got more and more involved in. You could almost say I was managing her career in certain ways up to a certain point. I became the distributor of her films with the blessing of the folks who owned her films at that time. It wasn't something weird, but a partner was something weird. Actually owned the copyright to the films. And we were doing some theatrical stuff, and some very generous people flew around the country. I'll call out the people at Alamo Draft House who are deeply involved with AGFA that released the produce this new Blu-ray release. We had a wonderful experience with them in Austin, Texas at the original theater. In fact, Doris was so afraid she would miss her flight, which I think left very early in the morning, like 6 or 7 in the morning, that the folks who own the Alamo Draft House and have gone on to own the Alamo chain, they literally kept her up all night at an all-night diner, and they stayed up all night. I frankly went to bed. I had a later flight. They stayed up all night with her. They were so generous, and I'm sure they had a ball. So, that's the story. We got her, we got all sorts of unexpected attention because wherever we took our horse and pony show, Boston, New York, Austin, Texas, we were at the New Art in Los Angeles, or is it in Hollywood? You would know better than I where it is technically. We got good press coverage from the local Arts and Entertainment Weekly. They'd write feature pieces on Doris. National Public Radio called me to ask if we were interviewed on Terry Gross's Fresh Air. For people who know National Public Radio, that's kind of a very prestigious show.
Yeah.
And, Terry Gross spoke with both of us. She was fascinated to figure out who Doris was. She was on Late Night with Conan O'Brien, his original show, twice. And we became very friendly with the producer, who was a lovely guy and really loved Doris and started calling her all the time just because he got such a kick out of her. And she was a great guest for people. I know that at least one of those is kicking around on YouTube, or it was not long ago. You want to go see her. She was hysterically funny and nothing scripted. She just was a spontaneous, lively, original, fun lady. And she made those shows. In fact, Roger Ebert was the other guest the second time.
That's right. Yeah.
And, being a good manager, I brought some 8x10 stills, although we didn't have stills of Doris, and I had stills of Chesty Morgan from Deadly Weapons. So we had Doris sign one for Roger Ebert. We kind of knew through his relationship with Russ Meyer, he was kind of a big bosom guy anyway.
Yeah.
So we gave him the signed Chesty Morgan still. And he wound up staying out on the set when Doris came out. Usually guests leave and the next guest would come out. He stayed there, and they had the funniest exchange. Doris was so funny. At any rate, I had a great, and then after the show was over, I was there in the green room with her. We went to some cheap deli around the corner to get something to eat. I mean, we didn't have any money, and she said, "Michael, I bet we're the only people who have been on that show who came to this crummy place to eat dinner." Although when she was a guest at the New York Underground Film Festival, they got some sort of a sponsorship, believe it or not, from the Waldorf Astoria, that I guess wanted to seem hip to young people, so they gave them a couple of free rooms for their prestige guests. And so Doris stayed at the Waldorf Astoria. She was only there for a couple of days, and we're hanging out in the room with her, and she was terrified, though, to order room service because she was certain that the deal didn't include food. It was just the rent for the room, and she was afraid of having to spend $8 for a grapefruit. You know what I mean? We only found out after the fact that she could have ordered whatever she could have ordered whatever she wanted, lobster. So,
oh man!
But I mentioned that in part because that's what she was like. She wasn't an exploitative person who said, "Oh, let's run up a big bill at the wall." You know what I mean? She was very, very conscientious about other people. First of all, she loved people. She never forgot you. I forget names all the time. You tell me your name 4 times, I'm still trying to remember it. I just don't have a good skill for that. But she remembered everybody's name the second they said it, and then she'd talk to you 5 minutes later like she'd known you forever. Jose, right? You probably remember.
Yeah.
It's like you've known her forever. So she was really honestly a lovely person. I don't know what else to say. I mean, we had a few arguments along the way, and she behaved badly a few times. She could be kind of immature, and she could be exasperating. I remembered trying to put together a deal with her. HBO made a little special segment about her for their old Real Sex program.
Oh,
that
wow.
might be kicking around out there on the internet as well. It used to show endlessly. In later years, I became a college lecturer, teaching, as a college professor, and I used to occasionally have students start sniggering one day, and then I'd hear through the grapevine that they had seen me on Real Sex. But since I was teaching film history by that point in my life, I figured, well, it's justifiable, right? It's not just I'm not just hanging out with the lady who made dirty movies. I'm a film historian, so it's legit. But,
exactly.
We got her on Real Sex, and I remember she wanted to kind of negotiate different things, and I wound up in the middle, back and forth, calling the producer, calling her. I got a little tired of being the middleman sometimes, I got to admit. But I will say, I acquired some skills as a result of it, and I'm endlessly grateful to Doris too for everything I learned by hanging out with her. She was the real deal. I mean, any of you out there? Anybody who says, "Gee, I'm thinking about making a movie," Doris would say, "Just make it. Just if you really want to do it, there's a way to do it." And so she was inspiring in that way too.
Absolutely. One of our commenters says, "Awesome interview. I wish film schools would highlight more of these filmmakers like Doris. I feel like if you're just starting out in film, you can learn a lot from these low-budget filmmakers." Absolutely.
I think that's a great observation. I did not insert Doris into too many of the courses I taught, but I did actually create a course at one place where I taught. Created an original course that hadn't been taught there before on history of women filmmakers, and you better believe I gave her a week, because the truth is Doris was certainly the most prolific woman director working in the world in the 1960s, the most prolific woman director working in the whole world. And there were only a few others you think of, like Agnes Varda working in France, very few. And there were some women in the underground working in 16 millimeter. But Doris was, unprecedented, and absolutely has a very important role, very important place in the history of women directors, if you want to contextualize it that way. But also, I agree with the comment. I know somebody years ago who used to show, another professor used to show some clips from Doris's movies just because he felt that the way Doris put movies together was so counterintuitive that everybody immediately understood what film style was when you watched one of her films. Because you can't, when you're watching a Doris Wishman movie, you're not just watching a story, you're watching the making of a movie. With crazy camera angles, crazy edit choices, crazy music, voices that don't match lip movements. You're totally aware of the fact that a movie is a crafted thing that somebody made. Jose, you're a filmmaker, and all filmmakers know what I'm talking about. Most critics talk as if a movie was just something that kind of like popped out of your head while you're dreaming one night. But a movie is an endless bitch goddess that demands your time, and it works against you all the time. Every time you turn that camera on, something's gonna go wrong, right?
Yeah.
And so Doris, but classical filmmaking style smooths over all the rough edges, throws away all the bad takes, and makes it look like if it was effortless and it's just about the story. But a Doris movie reminds you every second you're watching it that you are watching an art object called a movie. And it was made by somebody, and movies are made a certain way. So I agree, Doris is an excellent, excellent subject for people to understand better what movies really are, how they really work, and to start thinking hard about style. Because that's really, where it's at from my point of view at the end of the day. The people who endure are people who come up with some crazy-ass different way of doing things. That's it.
Absolutely. So let's start at the beginning of her career. You sent me a list of movies. We're going to sort of chart, I guess, the top 10 of her works. We're going to start at now I might be mistaken, but is this the first movie?
Yeah, Hideout in the Sun was her first film of any sort. She really conceived of the idea and started making it in the late 1950s, but it wasn't released until, in fact, it was January of 1960 it got its first play date. So the 60s were sort of born with Hideout in the Sun. And Hideout in the Sun is a nudist camp film. The image you're seeing shows a nudist enjoying the sunshine. And Doris did not invent nudist movies. It was a genre that actually goes back to the 1930s and the original first generation of exploitation filmmakers. I don't know if you can hear, by the way, there's a fire truck going by. I live in New York City, and it seems whenever I'm interviewed, there are 17 fire trucks and 23 police cars that go by. Hopefully they'll pass by pretty soon. At any rate, the nudist genre was sort of reborn in the mid to late 50s because a movie called Garden of Eden really got a lot of attention. It was a little melodrama set in a nudist camp, and it was opening in theaters all over the country, and it was being challenged legally. It was called obscene because you could see women's butts and breasts, which was something you never saw in a Hollywood film because it wasn't allowed. But it turns out that most of the jury said, and the Supreme Court had ruled that nudity in nudist magazines, this is in the 50s, couldn't be construed as obscene because the nudists sincerely believed that walking around naked in nature was healthy, psychologically made you a better person, all that kind of stuff. They weren't doing it because it was dirty, was the argument. So you couldn't call it dirty, just like you couldn't call a nude Roman sculpture in an art museum dirty. So this guy who made Garden of Eden said, oh, well, if you can't call a nudist magazine dirty, then you can't call a nudist movie dirty either. Although he was very careful and also became aware of the fact early on that if he showed full frontal nudity, forget it. Nobody was going to go for that. So you saw boobs and butts. And Doris actually knew the fellow, Walter Bebo, who made that film because she had worked in film distribution going back to the late 1940s with a company that handled exploitation films, but also art films, interestingly, a company run by her cousin. And she knew how to sell films, but she didn't know how to make them. But when she saw the success of this nudist film, she said, there's a low-budget movie that I could make. And she used to joke, she said, I decided to make a nudist movie because it was cheap. No costumes, right? but it was theoretically inexpensive. So Hideout in the Sun was her first film. It took her actually a couple of years to get it released because she shot it once and claimed the footage was unusable. There's a long story there. And whether that's entirely true is unclear to me. There you go, a lobby card from the film. That's Dolores Carlos in the middle who stars in the movie. And the film became her first feature film. And by the way, I've done extensive research over the years looking for ads for her films in newspapers. I used to have to use a very limited database that had like New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times. But now with like newspapers.com, you can find newspapers from small cities and even small towns all over the world. So I've documented, hundreds of play dates for her films. And I can say with certainty that Hideout in the Sun had a very, very extensive play date, a very extensive run, theatrical run, which pretty much means that the film made a lot of money, relative to other films. So when Doris claims that film was really successful, she was telling the truth based on that evidence. And it played all over the country. And it was probably one of the most successful nudist films that was released at that time.
Wow.
So that started her career. And then, as you know, the next several films she made were all nudist or nudist camp films. Nude on the Moon was the second one. Although Doris, again, never quite understanding how to do things exactly the right way. She got it into her head to make a movie that would be about, quote, a nudist colony on the moon. And the nudists are supposedly nude moon aliens. Right? And the film, for people who know the movie, it was shot in the Coral Castle down in South Florida, which is a kind of a very strange, interesting landscape used in a few other films as well. But the mistake Doris made was she took that movie to the New York State Censor Board. There was censorship in New York State up until 1965. The end of 1965 is the last film that was formally, it goes back to the 1920s. Every movie showed in New York State and in New York City went before a censor board until 1965. There was no national censorship in America, but many states and cities had local censorship. And then there was no rating system. That didn't come until 1968.
Right.
So all Hollywood movies from the classical period were technically G-rated, general audiences, right? Through a kind of agreement the studios entered into, they wouldn't deal with this subject, they wouldn't deal with that subject. But Doris's films and other independent films could fool around more, right? But the censor board could tell you no way. They might not like something. They might see a couple seconds and say, we don't like that. You cut out those few seconds and we'll let you show the film. So Doris took Nude on the Moon to the censor board, and the censor board felt that they were compelled to license nudist films because nudist films had been found, not to be obscene by courts. But when she took Nude on the Moon to them, they said, this isn't a nudist movie. She said, yes, it is. They're moon people who are nudists. And the censor board, who must have had a lot of fun whenever Doris walked in the door, said, Doris, forget it. And they refused to give it a license. It was rejected in toto, was what it said on the censorship records. They completely refused to let her play the film in New York State, which isn't necessarily a big deal. There's a lot of other country out there, right? But New York State and New York City particularly was such an important film market. It was the place where everybody premiered their movies, and it was like a test market. If it did well in New York, then distributors around the country were likely to take it. If it didn't do well in New York or it didn't have a New York playoff, they were like, what's this? We don't know. We don't want it. So if you couldn't get it played in New York, you were in big trouble. So she did eventually find a distributor who was peddling it, I found, on the West Coast and some obscure places around the country with no censorship. West Coast, California had no censorship because the movie studios would never let the state of California create censorship. They were too powerful, right?
Right.
But so you could get away with it. Like Russ Meyer his films became popular on the West Coast because you could get away with some things in California you couldn't get away with in New York. But the film really Nude on the Moon had hardly any playoff. One of her best known films, one of her most beloved films, but you could hardly find any ads for it at the time it came out in the early 60s because she couldn't get it played in New York, so nobody would take it. They were either afraid they'd get busted or they didn't trust the film would make money. Yeah.
Right. Wow. Now, how many nudist movies did she end up making?
I think the total is 8, although a couple of them are the product of this weird project she engaged with. She bought a film that had been made in Italy. It was really kind of a documentary, like a mondo type film.
Okay.
Although they were called sexy films. They were films that were about exotic nightlife. There used to be a lot of nightclubs in the 50s and 60s with like showgirls, sexy dancing. They weren't burlesque. They were like high-class burlesque, some of them. Or like in Paris, they'd have like the Moulin Rouge, and there was like a kick line where the women were topless for some, this was racy stuff then.
Right.
So there was a whole genre of films coming out of Italy about these exotic nightclub acts from exotic, expensive nightclubs. There are tons of them, though, like dozens of them, actually. And Doris wound up buying one of these films at a kind of a fire sale screening in New York City because the people who imported it couldn't find anybody who wanted to distribute the movie. So she bought it like she was going to be a distributor. What she did is she cut it up, took all the separate scenes from different cities around the world. It didn't really have any story. It was just different scenes. And then she intercut nudist footage, scenes in nudist camps, and she'd go back and forth like, oh, in Paris, they enjoy this kind of nightlife. And then you'd see this nightclub act. And then the next scene would be, but during the day, they like to go to nudist camps, right? So she took the footage from that movie, sliced and diced it, added new nudist footage, and she made 2 movies out of it, 2 separate movies. Now, the second one, admittedly, looking at the ads, had a very limited playoff as well. And this was kind of late in the nudist cycle. So she was kind of running out of steam when she did that. But those are 2 of the 8, And then her last nudist film was lost for many years. But these folks with whom I've been friendly for over 20 years now, they have a wonderful film club in Germany. They actually found a German language print of the movie. The Prince and the Nature Girl is the name of the film. And I worked with them on a DVD release some years ago where we recreated the original English soundtrack and stuff. So that was her last nudist film before she shifted gears completely into the black and white so-called sexploitation movies that people probably know her best for.
Yeah, I actually remember way back when that came out, you sent me a copy of that release, The Prince and the Nature Girl. Yeah. And there may or may not be an Easter egg on that of another film you could watch on that.
Oh, there may be. People can look. Yeah.
Potentially may be there. All right. So
always the folks who release that love surprising people. So check it out. Yes. But I would I would say I'm very happy to say this. I'm not just a Doris shill. It's not her best film. Mm-hmm. I think she was kind of running out of steam, but it's definitely a Doris Wishman film for sure. And it was such a pleasure to find it, and be able to, incorporate it into her body of work. For a completist like me, it was a real treasure to actually finally see it.
Absolutely. I guess at this point, have you seen all of her movies, or is there still some stuff that's lost?
Well, the 2 films she made from the Italian Mondo film, that's lost. She had a story about what happened to it, but her basic claim, which I think was probably true, was that she didn't really own the film. She had licensed it for American distribution. And when you licensed a film from abroad, you only had it for a certain number of years. It might have been 7 or 8 years. So what she claimed was that she just returned the negative to the producers. I said, you returned it with all that nudist footage that you had in it? She said, yes, I did. Now, maybe she did, maybe she didn't, but none of that footage has ever turned up. So those films, and I think it was UCLA, when I was first digging deeply into Doris's career after she died, and I really determined to start writing a biography, I snooped around and found that I believe it was the UCLA Film Archive. It might be another California college, but they claimed to have a print of one of those 2 films. They're called Behind the Playgirls International and Behind the Nudist Curtain.
Okay.
And they claimed to have a print of Playgirls International. When I corresponded with them, they said, "Oh, it's still in our catalog, but actually, it had vinegar syndrome, which is a kind of a disease that attacks film prints. And some people feel that it's contagious, and some people feel it's don't. But usually, when a film is afflicted with vinegar syndrome, which causes it to decay." Right. They at least quarantine it. Well, what I was told was that they disposed of it, thinking it had no value. So that, to my knowledge, which is almost 20 years ago now, was the only known print of one of those 2 films. And it's shocking to me that one hasn't turned up because, my goodness, there must have been at least a half a dozen of them kicking around the country. But yeah, I've never seen those 2 films. But I do have what are called the continuity scripts from them, because Doris submitted them to New York State for censorship.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of the good byproducts of censorship. It creates records. So
Paper trail.
paper trail. So New
Yeah.
York State required that you submit a dialogue continuity, they call it, because one of the things they censored was the dialogue. You couldn't use curse words, etc. So they wanted to have it written down, and someone would review it and make sure you didn't say shit or something in there, right?
Right.
If you did, they'd make you cut it out.
Mm-hmm.
So you had to type up every word of dialogue in the release print. This isn't just the original script. It's got to be a transcription of the dialogue in the release print. So I got that stuff from the New York State Archive a million years ago because they preserved all those records in New York State. So you can read the dialogue continuities and know exactly what the voiceover narration was, describing the different scenes and whatnot. Also, bits of footage from those films did find their way into some of her later movies.
Oh.
They were resurrected from her famous collection of so-called outs. She had all of these little scraps of negative that were leftover shots from movies that didn't, Doris had an almost 1-to-1 shooting ratio, right? Doris didn't do 7 takes. There was none of this take 4, take 5. It was like you get it the first time, or it was very rare for her to shoot more than 1 take. But she did always wind up, of course, with a little extra footage. But then she tried to recycle that and use it in a later film. So little scraps of those 2 films do wind up in some of her later movies. So if you're ever watching a Doris movie and you see a piece of color footage of like can-can dancers for a few seconds or a hula dancer, Doris didn't shoot that. Those are little scraps left over from those 2 films. So to answer your question, yeah. What else is missing? I've seen everything. Yeah. Although I do have one speculation that she might have been working on a third, and she might have actually shot elements of a third hardcore porno movie in the 70s.
Interesting.
We haven't talked about that, but in the 70s, Doris did wind up making a few hardcore XXX porno movies because that's where the whole sexploitation market went. She wasn't proud of it. She used to deny it. She actually would leave the room. Chuck Smith shot at least one of them. He said, yeah. Doris would leave the room and say, Chuck, you know what to do. You shoot this. And he would shoot the hardcore scenes with the actors,
Wow. Yeah, we actually had a question.
I have evidence from Doris's archive that there may have been a third porno feature. The material I have available including signed releases for a movie with well-known New York porn actors like Harry Reams working on it. But, the title of the film, the cast of the film doesn't line up with the 2 pornos that we know for a fact she did make. So I don't know what happened to it, but I will tell you one other story. Late in her life, she used to keep a couple of milk crates with scraps of film or outs when she was down in Florida. And she became friendly with a fellow down there who told me after she died that he asked her to come over to her house. He was one of the very few people Doris was close enough to actually invite over to her house. And they sat down with scissors and cut up all of this negative into little pieces and threw it away in garbage bags.
Oh, wow.
So that could be what happened to the porno footage. I mean, it makes sense to me that Doris might have saved it thinking, you can always sell porno, right? He would have recognized that there was a certain amount of commercial value to hardcore footage. She hated to throw anything away. But then why would she destroy it? Because also, I did recover from her nephew's garage after she died various documents and what we call Doris's papers, what was left of her archive, which was very limited, and also another box full of outs of stuff. And a lot of elements from A Night to Dismember, her horror film.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
But there was no porno stuff there. So I do have a theory that she might have made a third porno film that may have never been completed. But that she certainly shot parts of, because I have release forms with the day in which she was shooting. And believe me, she wouldn't have had these people signing release forms if they weren't right there in a location to be shot that day. That's the only reason those forms exist. But the footage they shot, CJ, if people know 70s New York porn, CJ Lang, I mean, these are people that you work with in other places, but when you look at the totality of the release forms, It's nothing that lines up with their other pornos. So that may be another thing I've never seen.
Another lost one. Yeah, we got a question from Brian. He says, there's a rumor Doris did a few hardcore porn films. Now, you mentioned there's two. Let's talk about those two, because I think those are coming to Blu-ray pretty soon.
I mean, to answer the question, it used to be a rumor, 20 years ago, 25 years ago. But Doris was outed pretty quickly. Something weird, particularly, put out, they started putting out a series of DVDs of kind of low budget 16 millimeter 70s porn, because they were acquiring a lot of that stuff. Mm-hmm. And one of them looked curiously like a Doris Wishman movie. Again, stylistic similarities were quite stark. But I mean, if you knew her films well, you could actually hear her voice dubbing a few lines of dialogue, which she used to do now and then, and there were little bits of outtakes from some Doris Wishman movie. So, I got Doris to admit near the end of her life that she did make the films, because she used to say, I never did it. And the reason she told me she used to deny it is because she said she was embarrassed to be involved with hardcore porn, and also didn't want her sister to know, because she would be embarrassed for her sister, whom she loved dearly and depended on in many ways, to know that she made porno. So it's not a rumor. She made 2 porn films. Go look on IMDb or look anywhere. They're very accessible, and actually they're pretty interesting Doris Wishman movies. The problem with porno, and with any talented filmmaker who makes porno, is that generally when the hardcore sequences start, the movie stops. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are only so many ways to shoot what Doris would have known what the term stopping means, right? There are only so many ways to shoot sex. So it's very hard to get your style in there. My dear friend, the late Joe Sarno, another filmmaker from the 60s, 66 relation I was very close to, and whose career I know a great deal about and have researched a great deal. He used to say the same thing. He made wonderfully stylistically interesting films in the 60s, but when porno came in, he was hesitant to go into it because it wasn't your film anymore. When the genitals took over the screen, it became this kind of hypnotic, experience. It had nothing to do with cinema.
Yeah, right.
So it's, if you set aside the porno sequences and just watch the movie, like if you could cut them all out and squeeze the movie down to a little 20-minute movie that had no porno in it, you'd see a really good Doris Wishman movie. All the classic elements of a Doris Wishman movie are there. It's just padded out with long, hardcore sex scenes. So anyway,
gotcha.
I hope that answers the question. And I do recommend, you see them if you're a Doris fan, and not everybody has a taste for. Well, I don't know. Things have changed a lot. I used to say years ago, not everybody has a taste for porno, but the internet has probably made porno so ubiquitous that everybody's seen it, can tolerate it. But if you don't if you don't mind wading through hardcore sex, there are some very interesting Doris Wishman movies to see there. Yeah.
What are the titles for those movies?
Come With Me, My Love, and Satan Was a Lady. And
of course.
There may be some confusion with respect to the latter because, again, late in her life, another producer, another angel, came along and put up some money for Doris to make a movie. And they made a movie, and she didn't know what to name it, but she always liked the title Satan Was a Lady, so she used it again. So there are 2 Satan Was a Ladies. One of them was made right near the end of her life in the later 90s, and that was released by the people who produced it. But it's very different from the hardcore Satan Was a Lady, so make sure you're getting the one from the mid-70s.
Gotcha. I think maybe this month or next month, Vinegar Syndrome is releasing both of those on a Blu-ray. So
it's news to me. I don't work with them, but I'm always delighted to see. Maybe they have better elements too. Again, no criticism, but something weird put out what they had. So sometimes they would have kind of splicy 16 millimeter prints and stuff. So I don't know if it will enhance the experience tremendously to find a better print. But sometimes it does make a difference. I remember, I remember seeing these films on videotape coming off of bad prints, and it did make the films feel cheaper and less professional. And then later, when you could actually get a negative and do a high quality digital transfer, all of a sudden you say, oh, wait a minute, this was a real movie. and you get a better sense of how it would have actually looked in some Times Square movie theater. It didn't look all scratched up and splicey, and then you've got those bad transfers.
Yeah, blurry.
Videotape was a very soft medium. You know what I mean? So it is cool to see the quality of the original footage. So hopefully, I look forward to seeing those. Thanks for telling me.
Yeah, I'll let you know when they come out. Let's move on to one of her, I think it's one of her creepier movies, and that's Indecent Desires.
Yeah.
Tell us about this one.
A terrific film, a really brilliant film. For people who haven't seen it, I'll lay out the premise just as a teaser because it's one of her most engaging premises. It's a story about a kind of a loner, a lonely loner who lives alone in a little shabby apartment, and he finds a doll, like a little girl's doll, not a Barbie, like a baby doll, there you go, like a baby doll. He finds a baby doll in the trash, and he also finds this kind of like Cracker Jack plastic ring. And he doesn't quite know this, but he takes the baby doll home, and he puts on the ring for no good reason, just fooling around. And it turns out that it gives him this magical power to control the body of this woman, who theoretically looks like the doll in some way or other. We see the super. So I won't give away more than that because the film is incredibly engaging, and I mean, one of Doris's most imaginative plot premises. It was shot, interestingly, in the neighborhood just behind the apartment where she had just moved after marrying her second husband. And I had kind of wondered for years about where it was filmed, and not too many years ago, within the past 10 years, I'm getting older, so everything seems like it was 5 years ago. It was really 10. Probably about 10 years ago, I knew where the apartment was. I live in New York City, so I took the train out there. It was Forest Hills in Queens, and I walked and walked and walked around the whole neighborhood, and lo and behold, I found the locations in the neighborhood right behind her apartment, just by getting screen grabs of the different buildings, the doors that people enter in, the streets, like that still you put up, that screen capture you put up a minute ago. That corner, I'm looking for, and I found it. So it was right behind her building.
Wow.
And again, made with just a couple of people, including a wonderful actor named Michael Alimo, who worked with Doris also in her film A Taste of Flesh, but he worked an awful lot with Joe Sarno. There was a little link there where some Sarno people worked a little bit with Doris, including Joe Sarno's wife, Peggy Steffens, who started working with Joe in the mid-'60s. And she doesn't remember how, but somehow she became a principal, really the star of one of Doris's films, A Taste of Flesh, that Michael Alimo was also in. So there's a little overlap between Joe Sarno's career and Doris's career there. But Michael Alimo was a wonderful actor, great, a lot of character, and he went on to do television work and other things on the West Coast. So he's one of those people who was starting a career, appeared in some low-budget films, and actually went on to have, a noteworthy career. Most of the people who work with Doris, the women particularly, were more like models and actual actresses, And it's kind of rare to find people who went on to have straight careers. But actually, a few other people who work with Doris, Tony LoBianco, who went on to have a very well-known career as an actor. He's in the French Connection, a title that I hope everybody watching is well aware of. He has a very noteworthy role in the French Connection. And The Honeymoon Killer is a wonderful independent film. It's become kind of a cult film.
Love it.
But he had he's had a noteworthy career, and also I won't go into it, but a couple of other actors who went on to do quite a bit of work with television and stuff later on. They used pseudonyms when they worked with Doris, but eventually did interesting things. So she also, not just Doris, but people in that low-budget world in New York in the 60s, gave a lot of young actors, also camera people, sound people, gave them a chance to cut their teeth, start their careers, and many of them went on to do so-called bigger and better things.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about one of her celebrity movies, quote unquote. This is Blaze Star Goes Nudist.
Sure.
First off, who is Blaze Star, and why do we care if she goes nudist or not?
Sure. Blaze Star was, I'll say one of, but probably was the best known stripper / burlesque queen in America in the 1950s. And she partially became so well known because she had an affair with the governor of Louisiana, and there's been a film made about it starring Paul Newman, which goes back to the 90s, right? So again, for those of you who are under 30, this is an old movie. But there was actually a biopic made about Blaze's affair with Earl Long, the governor of Louisiana, called Blaze. So through the tabloids, she became quite well known. But also, anybody who knew the stripping world, she was a young, vivacious, busty gal who grew up in the hills of Appalachia and had a very famous and noteworthy burlesque act where she had a couch rigged up with fans underneath it. And at a certain point, she was stripping on the couch. It was kind of like a day bed without a back, I think. And then when she was getting down to having very little on, the fans would turn on and they'd kind of blow this red silk up to look like flames. So it was like the couch caught on fire because she was so hot, right? And she was a little lady with a big personality. Blaze was getting a tad older by the time Doris met her, but she was still working all over the East Coast at least. She seemed to range the East Coast, and was actually appearing in a club. And I've actually documented this in the Miami and Miami Beach newspapers. Was appearing at a club down there. Doris got the idea to approach her, and I kind of love the idea that this lady, producer, director, approaches Blaze and said, "You want to make a movie with me?" And she's like, "Oh, sure, that would be kind of cool to work with a woman filmmaker." So, since Blaze was the first actress that Doris worked with who actually already had a name, as they say in the entertainment business, it was agreed that they would make her. She herself would basically be the character, although they did give her a different name. They use her. They use her actual real name in the film at one point. And they say that she's a movie actress, not a stripper. But the film was released as Blaze Star Goes Back to Nature or Blaze Star Goes Nudist. And actually, there was a video release of it kicking around for years called Blaze the Original. But it was again a good move for Doris, because Blaze had a big name. So when you saw Blaze Star on the marquee, that probably got a lot of people to go in and check it out.
Right.
And Blaze had fairly conspicuous assets up top. So, in old-time burlesque at that time, they didn't strip down to nothing. They had to wear pasties or a kind of a skimpy bra, or the show would get busted. There were laws against naked ladies running around on stage until the later 60s, when things all went crazy.
Right.
And then you not only had, you had live sex shows by the early 70s in New York City, right? Literally, people having sex, in front of you.
Wow.
So even if you saw Blaze stripping in the early 60s, you never saw her boobs. So if you want to see Blaze Star Goes Nudist, you got to see the real McCoy. Doris said Blaze was a lovely person to work with. And I was able to interview Blaze in an unusual way years ago. She died, fairly recently.
Oh.
She lived to a ripe old age. But many moons ago, she had retired back to the hills. She lived in Baltimore for a long time and ran a famous strip joint there. I think that there were money people behind her, but she was nominally the owner of the club, and she was there every night like a hostess. Was it called the 2 O'Clock Lounge? Do I have that right? She did that all through the 80s, whatnot. She got older and older, but, she was kind of like, "Hey, fellas, having a good time?" That kind of thing, right? It was old-timey stuff. But I was able to interview. Blaze did not want to be interviewed in person. But I was able to reach her through her brother, who was a big help. And what he would do is I would email him all these questions, and then he would run across the street. He told me he lived around the corner or something, and ask her the questions and write down the answers and come back and email them back to me. And it turned out that it was, quite a bit of help, actually. She confirmed some things and helped clarify others. And I regret the fact that I never did get to speak to her, but I seized the opportunity to mail a copy of her memoir, a book that came out in the 70s, and mailed it down to her brother, and he got it autographed for me and sent it back. So I do have
Nice.
that. But yeah, Doris made a smart move bringing her on board because there were almost no nudist films that had name, recognizable, internationally known figures starring in them. And again, based on the number of ads and the size of the ads that you find in newspapers all over the country at that time, the film clearly did, very well. It was probably Doris's other really, financially successful nudist film from that period. And I don't think she would see success on that level again until the Chesty Morgan movies, which I'm sure will get mentioned shortly.
Oh yeah, well we're gonna get to Chesty.
Speaking of big bosoms, right?
Yeah. Oh man, absolutely. First, we touched on it briefly, but let's talk about probably her. In my opinion, this is probably her most well-known title, and it's your favorite movie, Bad Girls Go to Hell.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the production of this one.
Sure. Doris, around 1964, it was pretty clear that the nudist film genre had played out. The movies weren't really drawing audiences anymore because they were kind of mundane. David Friedman, who was a well-known figure in the 60s sexploitation world, and his involvement in exploitation predates it. He wrote a wonderful book called A Youth in Babylon. If people can find that, I'm sure it's long out of print. I've had it for a wonderful hardcover copy for 25 years, but if you can find it, it's a wonderful history of early exploitation. But Dave Friedman, who had been involved with making nudist films with Herschel Gordon Lewis, they jumped on that bandwagon too. Dave Friedman said the nudist film things became passé. He said there were only so many volleyball games that the audiences could stand to watch, But that was one of the tropes of nudist films, that they volleyball, although, again, you couldn't show full frontal nudity, so the volleyball teams the team with their back to you had no clothes on, but the team on the other side of the net facing the camera were always wearing bathing trunks or bikini bottoms because you couldn't see full frontal, right?
Right.
The nudist genre was getting passé. Doris would have known that because they just stopped making money. They'd go out there and they'd get hardly anything back. But rising up over the horizon, where this was a sort of new genre of films, and we could debate where it comes from, but I would say the most important progenitor in some ways was Russ Meyer, with films like Lorna and Mudhoney. Although having said that, around 1964, you have films being produced out of New York, like The Orgy at Lil's Place, or the Olga films, right?
Yeah.
White Slaves of Chinatown, Olga's Girls, and also the early Joe Sarno melodramas. And these films kind of stank, were redolent of a new genre of American-made sex films that came to be called sexploitation. Now, people may or may not know this, but most movies released in the United States right up through the later 60s were black and white. And I'm talking about Hollywood movies. Only big productions were color. We're talking right through the mid-60s. Most regular dramatic films were still black and white in the mid-60s. So it was normal to make a dramatic film in black and white. The nudist films had been shot in color. But, they were set in exotic locales, and I suppose it didn't hurt to see rosy skin tones and on various parts of the body. Good way to put it, Jose. So that helped, to make them a little bit more fleshy and interesting. But people, to make dramatic films, typically shot in black and white. So Doris must have seen this happening. I wouldn't say that she was a student of the market exactly. I don't think she went to movies that often, but she was hanging around in editing rooms and dubbing studios. She was around filmmaking people, and she would have also noticed what was playing in Times Square, and she was talking to those distributors because they had handled her nudist films. So it became clear to her that a different kind of movie was the new exploitable film, and that was sexploitation. And the big difference outside of color and black and white with sexploitation is nudist films showed nudity, but they involved no sex. Not even a hint of it. Nudist did not have sex, apparently, right? But sexploitation films were about sex with limited nudity. In fact, the first early ones, 64, 65, there's really no nudity. You know, but you might see people hugging and kissing and groping in a way that was a little hotter and dirtier than you'd see in a Hollywood film. And you might see some woman being undressed from the back, so you see her shirt coming off her shirt, you know, and in a way that was more lascivious and satisfying to the raincoat crowd than any Hollywood movie, right? So they felt dirty, you know? Even when you didn't see much, they felt dirty.
Right.
So Doris morphed into that. There's the immortal Darlene Bennett, who worked with Doris in a lot of movies, wearing this kind of, this sort of semi-see-through body stocking, right?
Yeah, they do a lot of that. The lingerie was almost the same kind of thing. There was that black, weird fishnet.
Sexy stuff. Nudists supposedly didn't like sexy stuff. They thought people should think the body was normal. It shouldn't be something that made you horny just to see somebody naked, you know. But the sexploitation movies were like, nope, this is about sex. So Doris shifted gears, you know. Now, she always had a good imagination for stories, so it wasn't a big deal to come up with new storylines. And she just started to work in black and white. And instead of going to Florida, which is where she shot most of her nudist films, although she shot in Pennsylvania and in New Jersey as well. They were nudist camps. The safest thing to do was to shoot in a nudist camp. Both because it gave the film some authenticity when you took it to a censor. You could say, but it's shot in a nudist camp, you know, so it's legitimate nudism, even though the girls were never really nudists, right? They were models. They weren't
right.
They were people who frequented the camp. But also, the big reason to shoot in a nudist camp is you were not going to get busted having naked people walking around naked, right?
Yeah.
Doris, by the way, here's something, a little teaser that nobody knows that will be in my book when it comes out, projected to be next year. I had a little delay, but next year, 2023, Doris got busted for public indecency while she was shooting her first film, Hideout in the Sun.
Wow.
I got the articles to prove it. A story she never told anybody, which she should have. It's a great story. So you really could get arrested for that. You know, I mean, public nudity was not legal. So you're not going to go to Central Park and shoot somebody walking around no clothes on, right? Or a park in Florida, right? So she worked in the nudist camps. Now, since there was no need to go to Florida, and since I think Doris understood this, the sensibility of the sexploitation was gritty and urban. In fact, Orgy at Lil's Place probably set the tone for Doris, and I never knew that she saw it, but she might have. It was about a young woman who comes to New York to become an actress, right?
Oh.
Don't forget, New York was far from the center of the film industry, although I've done tons of research on films made in New York, and it was the other important place where movies were made in America in the 60s, but they tended to be independent and gritty and unusual in many ways. But you know, actors and actresses came to New York as much as they went to Hollywood because of the theater. New York City was the fabled place where you became a famous actor because of the long history of theater and all of the many acting schools here, like the famous Actors Studio where James Dean and Marlon Brando won, and dozens of other well-known actors after them. So New York was full of people who came here to be actors, and Orgy at Lil's Place was about, young woman comes to New York to be an actor, but then she finds out, you've got to go to these sleazy parties where the producers paw you and all this kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
And get involved with alcohol and all the vices of the city, right? That's basically Orgy at Lil's Place. Joe Sarno taps into that kind of energy. And Doris's first black and white sexploitation film, The Sex Perils of Paulette, is literally that story. Paulette comes to New York to become an actress, hooks up with a young woman played by Darlene Bennett, that you showed up a minute ago, who turns out to basically be a prostitute. And, pretty much teaches Paulette that the only way she's going to pay her rent and support herself in this big, nasty city is by prostituting herself. So Doris slipped into that genre and that shift in sensibilities and made some wonderful, fabulous, genre grounding films. Some of the very best films. Again, she works against genre in certain ways. The protagonists tend to be women, which is fairly unusual. Although, again, another super important director in that genre, Joe Sarno, generally very frequently had female protagonists as well. Most of the time it was about some sleazy guy getting it on with girls, but Doris and Joe was more about the pathos of women in that situation and/or their lust. Sarno was very into women's desire, right?
Yeah.
Doris was more about the women kind of falling into these bad situations, so they're melodramas, they're kind of getting used and abused, that kind of a thing. But also they tend to be very strong, likable figures. Doris, by the way, used to dislike being called a feminist. Young women who met her late in life understandably asked her about feminism and that stuff, and she said, I didn't make movies as a woman filmmaker. I was just a filmmaker. I was just trying to make movies like a filmmaker. I never thought I was making women's movies, and she still doesn't. So she used to say, I don't want to be called a feminist. I think that I think in some ways there was a disconnect between the sensibilities of the younger women and Doris. You know what I mean? Doris wasn't trying to denigrate feminism or these women, but she just didn't think of herself in those categories.
Yeah, well,
in terms of legitimate feminism, she's a great feminist figure in filmmaking. If we mean by feminism being empowered and doing things that women typically didn't do or didn't have an opportunity to do. So she's an iconic woman filmmaker, but she didn't see herself within the context of the politics of feminism. She used to say, for instance, she didn't feel particularly marginalized because she was a woman. It was almost a fluke to her that there were no other women doing it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
No one ever gave me a chance to do this. She just did it. Kind of a thing.
I love it.
But and by the way, interestingly, sexploitation has a reputation for being a kind of anti or counter feminist genre, right? Because these are sex films for men, right? Masturbatory fantasies for men. But ironically, it's the genre that created a space in which the two most prolific women filmmakers of the period could work, Doris Wishman and Roberta Findlay.
Yeah.
Right? Who started off really as a camera operator, working with her husband, Michael Findlay, making also wonderful New York black and white sexploitation. But she became a very significant director and made tons of hardcore porno. And it turns out she actually directed more movies than Doris. I used to go around saying Doris was the most prolific woman director in the sound era. Now, I haven't looked closely enough at the past 20 years or so to see, but I doubt it. I doubt it because people don't make 3 movies a year anymore like they used to in the series. I don't think very few women have made more movies than Doris, more feature films, very, very few. But I used to say Doris was the most prolific because Roberta Findlay used to use only pseudonyms. But then it became clear that this movie was made by Roberta, that movie was made by... So Roberta actually has made a few more movies than Doris. So sexploitation and porn actually created the space, the inferno, in which women made tremendous contributions to filmmaking in the 60s and 70s. And, we can get into debates about whether that space was good for them or bad for them, whether their films are kind of a counter porn, those are all interesting and important discussions. But just as a kind of raw statistical fact, the most prolific women directors in the world in the 60s and through the mid 70s worked in sex films. So if you're going to do a complete survey, you've got to look there too.
That's that's an interesting fact because you look at these movies, like, how is this directed by a woman? How could this have been a woman filmmaker? But it is, and so this sort of brings up another question I've always had. Like, I wonder if, like, I'm a filmmaker, but if, like, showing naked dudes is making a lot of money, I'm not gonna go make naked dude movies. But Doris made a lot of naked lady movies, so I'm curious if this has ever come up in your research or anything. If Doris maybe was bisexual in any, I don't know if you ever brought that up.
No, I don't think so. I have no evidence of that. She was married twice, had a long history of male crushes going back to. I mean, she. One of the things that was vexing to me when I first started interviewing her relative to a biography was I wanted, I'm a kind of a movie buff and I'm kind of a pragmatic guy. I want film history, right? But all she wanted to talk about were her boyfriends and her romances, Doris was, to my knowledge, entirely heterosexual.
Okay.
I have no evidence to the contrary. But having said that, I don't think she was. And again, would I say this in front of her? I try not to say anything about Doris I wouldn't say in front of her because I just want to be honest, but I also don't want to talk about her like, oh, she's gone, so I can say whatever I want. I don't think Doris was a particularly sexual person. Or maybe I would phrase that a little bit differently if she were here, but I think she would probably agree. I don't think she lived her life in terms. She wasn't particularly caught up in sexual desire. She wasn't. Yeah, I don't think that was an important part of her makeup.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So I think it was more of a neutral experience for her. She saw that you could make money with the nudist films. I mean, this is a legitimate question. Why, out of all the things she could have done, why a nudist film? But her argument really holds some water. You could make a low-budget film which didn't require movie stars or anything more than some nudity.
Right.
And it could make money without question. So that shows somebody who's smart about a business risk. In other words, there were people making interesting and now historically important independent features at that time, the late 50s, early 60s, like John Cassavetes famously is considered like the father of the New York independent cinema, right? So he's making these like very interesting, psychologically complex dramas shot on a shoestring budget, right? But the truth of the matter is those movies made like no money, but which isn't a criticism. Maybe you didn't want them to. There were filmmakers who didn't care about that end of it, and there was an underground where people who liked those films could watch them and appreciate them, and it wasn't so much about the money. But Doris did want to make a living with this. She was her first husband was dead, so she was single. She wasn't technically widowed because, again, another fact that people may not know that will be clarified in my book. But Doris had actually separated from her first husband before he died. She used to tell the story as if she had been widowed by his sudden heart attack. But they actually had split up before he died of a heart attack. But they were involved together in certain ways. In fact, maybe even were going to make films together, but they were no longer really a couple. But she was alone, so she supported herself. And, she wasn't interested in living in an abandoned apartment with no water on the Lower East Side of New York. You know what I mean? That's where most of the bohemians who made underground movies, she had a decent apartment. She had to pay rent, and it was her sensibility, given where she came from, like a solidly middle-class family, that she should support herself.
Right.
And she had been involved in the film business going back to the mid to late 1940s. Right after the war, she started to work in film distribution. So, she approached it. She was introduced to the film business as a business, right? So I just think she made a calculated decision based on what she saw that you could make a very good return on investment with this kind of a film. And she said at first she was embarrassed, but you quickly got used to having somebody naked in front of you. I'll mention this, Jose, and I don't remember per se if you were there, but in that film we made with Doris at the end of her life, there were a few moments in the movie where the young woman who played the lead is topless. And she was a wonderful gal. I can't remember if she was a pseudonym or not, so I won't mention her name, but who she was. She's gone on to do really interesting things, and I've interacted with her in recent years, and she's lovely. And she was such a benefit, such a blessing to have her in that movie, because she also helped us produce it and stuff. But when it was time to do the nude scene, the topless scene, she was just like, "Oh well, we're making a movie," and she took off her top and the crew, me and the crew, was standing around, and none of us were leering at her. It was like she was already our buddy, and we knew she was doing something above and beyond for the film, and we totally respected her. It wasn't like, oh boy, we get to see her boobs, you know. And it wasn't just work either. It wasn't just work. I felt like there was a weird respect, like, hey, thanks for doing this. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
And we respected her for what she was doing, right? So I get the feeling that Doris just saw it as something kind of mundane, not a big deal. But as I mentioned earlier, when it came to the hardcore, actually filming genital penetration, fellatio, that she was like, nope, I don't want to be around this at all. The industry had changed to such an extent after Deep Throat in 1972. If you had a softcore film, you were lucky if you could find drive-ins in the South. Southern states were very unfriendly to hardcore for a longer period of time than other parts of the country, but everybody else went porno overnight. After Deep Throat, that's all anybody wanted to see was the real McCoy. So Doris had to either wing it and improvise some things, which she did. I'm sure we'll talk about Chesty Morgan, come up with some gimmicks that could get noticed through all the noise of porno.
Yeah.
Or she had to make porno. And so at some point she made a couple of low-budget pornos because, hey, look, and again, I can't, this is one of those things I'll never really document, but I'm pretty sure that she had people who put up the money for those films. I don't think it was really entirely her money.
Gotcha.
I think somebody said, I need a porno film. Can you make me one? And they said, I can give you this much money, and she did it. That's my theory.
Right.
And she did it. Of course, they came out as Doris Wishman movies because she only knows one way to make movies, her own crazy way, right?
Right.
But she so to get back to your question, and I think it's a very legitimate question. What was her sexual investment in these films? I don't think there was much of one, and I don't think that they. I think if you watch, I mean, there is like in Bad Girls Go to Hell, there is there's a very powerful and very moving moment in the film where the protagonist, she's living with this other woman and they have a sexual liaison. Pretty rare in Doris's movies, though, to have a girl scene, as they used to call it.
Yeah.
And there's a wonderful moment where the woman says to her, "You know, I love you," and the protagonist of Bad Girls Go to Hell says, "I know you do. That's why I must go." Meaning that, you know, there's a romantic link there, but for some reason the woman doesn't want to accept that relationship, so she's going to move on to other things. That's a very powerful piece of dialogue, by the way, for somebody like Doris, who's supposed to be such a nitwit, that she, you know, doesn't really understand human nature or the depths of human feelings. The first time I saw that movie, I thought that's one of the greatest emotional moments in a film. I mean, I've seen scores of great moments. It's not like Doris I'm saying she made the only important, authentic.
Right.
But I mean, it stands right up there with the greatest moments in a movie. I'm like, wow, that's powerful, you know? And particularly coming out of this little broken down, you know, 65-minute long movie that was showing at cinemas where men want to masturbate. I mean, these guys are sitting in there, all they want to see are tits, right?
Yeah.
And they're being treated to this kind of powerful stuff, and it's also about, you know, like homoerotic, not just sex but love. Well, anyway, there are weird moments of kind of like unexpected depth in Doris' movies. I'm not claiming that she secretly had a lot of depth, but she wasn't dumb about people. And again, the dialogue came from her. It's not like she hired someone to write that script. She did hire people to write a few screenplays, and she worked very closely with her niece, a wonderful woman I came to know very well named Judy Kushner, who used the name J.J. Kendall. Judy wrote the theme song music to some of Doris's earliest films, like Hideout in the Sun, I Met You in a Hideout in the Sun. She wrote the words and the music also. I'm mooning over you, my little moon dolls. Judy wrote that stuff, and that's Nude on the Moon. And then later, Judy actually collaborated with Doris on more like scenarios than fully fledged screenplays.
Okay.
Although, Jose, you may not know this, but Each Time I Kill, Judy Kushner was all over that script.
I mean, it felt like we had a lot of plot for a Doris
a lot
Wishman
of
movie.
plot.
Yeah.
Judy had more focus, I think, and more ability to sit down and like write out a screenplay than Doris did. Doris was probably riffing ideas off of her, and Judy would put it together. Doris, by the way, did create, again, probably with Judy, some unproduced screenplays which I own. I acquired the little few boxes of junk that we'll call Doris's papers, the contracts and stuff that were left after she died. I in fact purchased them from Judy, who was her estate. Doris had no children, so Doris did produce some screenplays that she probably intended to sell and not produce herself. I mean, Each Time I Kill, if she could have sold it, she would have. If we had any idea how to like run around Hollywood trying to sell that, we probably would have made some good money, better than trying to make a movie out of it. But I didn't know how to do that. Nobody else did. So our only option was to make a low budget movie with the money that her patron put up. So to get back to your question, Doris had a lot of personal investment in the films, but I wouldn't say that it was sexual. It just turned out that she started off with the Nudist thing, and now she was in the sex film business. She knew the people who purchased those films. She was in that business. It's kind of like if you own a grocery store, even if people's eating habits change, you're probably not going to go and open a record store. Record store. What am I, 500 years old?
Record store.
You're probably not going to go open a cell phone store. You're probably going to still you're going to still try to work with a food store.
Yeah.
Doris was in the sex film business by default, and she just morphed as it moved along. People like Joe Sarno did the same, although some of the people who got into sexploitation, they kind of fell off when the hardcore came along. It was really a new generation of people, I would say overall, who birthed and who thrived in the porno. Although you may not know this, Gerard Damiano, the late Gerard Damiano, who directed Deep Throat, and then a number of the best known and most prestigious hardcore porn films, Devil and Miss Jones, Memories Within Miss Aggie. Gerard Damiano started making black and white sexploitation in the late 60s in New York. He cut his teeth in that same world that Doris came out of, and then he transitioned into porno. And Doris sort of did too, but kicking and screaming and with no taste for it. So anyway, hope I answered your question.
No, absolutely. I've always wondered about that. Let's talk about her. I should say one of her biggest movies for many reasons. The incomparable Chesty Morgan in Deadly Weapons.
Right. This is the art. That was the artwork, by the way, from the British release of the film. That's the image on the British quad, which is the only place you see it. It's probably the nicest artwork for that film. That film, by the way, had a big international playoff.
Okay.
It was just played all over the world. Some of Doris's earlier films I've documented did in fact play in other countries, in Germany, in Belgium. The French tended not to have much of a taste for sexploitation because they had their own take on erotica. And I think they found American films to be a little too gritty and jarring for them. But by the time Deadly Weapons came along, and Double Agent 73, Deadly Weapons particularly played all over the world. Although the big reason for that, I think, is because it was actually distributed by American International Pictures. Okay. The very famous company that specialized in drive-in movies going back to the 50s. And they took over, in fact, purchased the international rights to the film. It had originally been acquired by a company based out of New England called Hallmark. And they owned a lot of movie theaters and drive-ins. They were really theater owners who bought movies to play in their own extensive chain of drive-ins and theaters because they didn't have to pay. They could keep all the money. If you're the distributor and you own the theater, you don't have to share the movie with it. You don't have to share the money with anybody.
Right.
They also released Last House on the Left. and,
Oh, wow.
and some other conspicuous films from that time. So Hallmark picked that up from Doris. They bought it from Doris outright. They bought the global rights. Doris literally sold the rights. Well, she's licensed internationally for a period of time, and then they reverted to her as a producer. And then they turned around and they made a deal with AIP. So that's the big reason it played all over the world. I mean, I also have an extensive archive of posters, stills, lobby cards, press books, all that stuff that you use to advertise movies. I have some holes in my collection because some of it's very rare, and even after 25 years, I haven't found certain things. But I have a lot of stuff for Doris's films, and great stuff for the Chesty Morgan films from Germany, from France. It did have a lousy playoff in France, but it did play there. From England, from Italy. It played all over, everywhere. Federico Fellini apparently saw Deadly Weapons in Italy. And we know this because he cast Chesty Morgan in his film Casanova, which came out after Deadly Weapons. He flew.
Oh, wow.
And I've known Chesty Morgan, who lives down in Florida, for many years now, and have hung out with her and interviewed her. You know, she was flown at Fellini's request to Italy to play a character in the film Casanova. Now, before the film was released, he cut that scene out of the film, but she played a named character in a discrete scene with Donald Sutherland, by the way.
Wow.
Donald Sutherland, the father of Kiefer Sutherland, has met Chesty Morgan and worked with her in a movie. I think it's the funniest thing in the world that Chesty Morgan only ever worked with two directors, Doris Wishman and Fellini. But you know, maybe it's not that much of an irony, because Fellini was also in his own way a crackpot who made crazy movies in his own way.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I think that on a certain level, geniuses all kind of like hang on the same level. Mm-hmm. Fellini might have been dealing with different ideas. He might have had a different crowd backing him, but in his own way, he was a brilliant crackpot who did things in a very strange way. And again, somebody's going to come along and say, I'm crazy comparing the two. But I mean, just on the level of a kind of intuitive, quirky sense for cinema and the unconscious ability to do things in a new and different way, I think they share company. And I don't think Fellini would be the least bit insulted to hear that I compared him in that respect to somebody like Doris. If he saw the films, he'd go, yeah, this lady, she's got it.
She gets it.
She's got something going there. You know, it's easier, it's harder in cinema, right? Because film aesthetics are tricky because most people just think about the story. Most people go to the movies for two reasons: stories and movie stars. And Hollywood has always known this. Mm-hmm. And then there's spectacle. There's certain types of special explosions and, you know, big giant sets and stuff. That's good too. Although that's really from the theater. You can get some of that in the theater too, right? But movie stars, stories and movie stars. But at the end of the day, movies are, you know, movies are a very discrete, unique art form that has its own little quirks and stuff like that. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I think people who really know cinema, like Fellini, would understand what I'm talking about. It's hard to do something really different. In the painting world, where we have over 100 years now of acceptance of like abstract painting and this notion that painting can be very intuitive and non-representational, it's a lot easier to find people who are highly skilled in representational painting who will say, oh, but this abstract work is also brilliant because I see how hard it was to come up with that approach, right? So it's trickier. Anyway, I'm starting to run far afield for you, maybe.
Oh, no, that's good. So she made
the Chesty Morgan films were born out of an earlier project. Doris met a guy named Sammy Petrillo. Hardly anybody probably remembers Sammy now, but he started his career as a Jerry Lewis sound alike and almost look alike.
Mm.
The young Jerry Lewis from the 50s. And he used to do a stage act where he kind of acted like Jerry Lewis, and he did a pretty good impression of him. And then he made a low-budget movie where he did a kind of Jerry Lewis. And apparently Jerry Lewis knew about him and was not too happy and maybe threatened to sue him. I don't know if that's really a true story. Although
Wow.
I'm not quite sure how you can sue somebody for stealing your persona. It's tricky. I mean, if I start acting like some famous movie star, can they sue me? I mean, I don't know. At any rate, Doris met Sammy, who was working on a low-budget film with a friend of his. They probably met at an editing house. And he probably plugged the idea of working on a movie with her, and he wanted her to help him finish his movie. And he said, I'm a comedian. I made this movie. And she got it into her head that she could make a comedy with him. And it turned out to be the film Keyholes Are for Peeping, which is out there and is part of her body of work. There you go. And some people might consider it to be one of Doris's least successful films and like one of her worst films. Like, even if you're a Doris fan, I have a funny feeling that some of Doris's fans, are like, oh, I don't need this. I don't really want to watch that movie again. To tell you the truth, it's one of my absolute personal favorites. But it's because it's such a personal film first of all, the notion that Doris would try to make a comedy and mean for it to be funny, intentionally funny.
Mm-hmm.
That's mind-blowing to me. And it gives us a sense of what Doris's sense of humor was, etc. But also, Doris used to dub all of her movies. People go watch them. She hired different actors to dub the voices, largely because she hadn't even written the dialogue for a lot of them, so she wasn't entirely sure what people would say. She almost never had a microphone and a recorder on location with her because she wasn't going to use that sound. But she'd go into a professional dubbing studio later and hire professional dubbing actors to dub the voices in once she knew what the hell the dialogue actually was. And then they would use cutaways and stuff to add bits of dialogue when she didn't have a shot where you could sync up the lips with the dialogue, right? But Doris used to do little bits of that herself. But in Keyholes Are for Peeping, she has Sammy Petrillo play himself and his mother. Mm-hmm. The mother's supposed to be like some sort of stereotypical old Yiddish mother, like some Jewish mother, right, from Doris's generation. And remember, Doris would be like, 110 years old now if she was still alive, something like that, right? Yeah, quickly doing the math about that. So Sammy plays the mother in drag with a wig and a dress, but Doris dubs the voice. And it's the most extensive dubbing job she ever does because the mother is a character who's throughout the whole film, right? So I also love the film because you hear Doris really playing a part in the film. It's her voice, but she's playing the part. But also Doris, who was Jewish, but did not really, she had a sort of a New York Jewish accent, but not this stereotypical sort of stage Jewish accent. So she's playing it up, Stanley, my son, this kind of thing. And it's so funny for me to hear her doing that accent, right? Which she didn't really, she had her own sort of New Yorky kind of accent, but it wasn't anything that over the top.
Right.
And it's so funny to hear. I'm like, here's Doris, and she's like doing a parody of a Jewish accent to play this Jewish mother. And she's Jewish, right? I always thought that was really great. And the movie, it's full of these crazy cutaways, some of them appropriated from that Italian film I was talking about before. Mm-hmm. And then leftover sex scenes from other films. It's such a hodgepodge. It's like a little compendium of bits and pieces of her earlier work. And then the jokes are just so not funny. They're really funny.
Yeah.
The notion that you're supposed to think this is funny makes it funny because they're so not funny they become funny. You have to have a certain sense of irony. Sammy Petrillo, by the way, who's supposed to be a comedian, is not at all funny. He was a lovely guy. I interviewed him at great length years ago. He's since died. But he was a very intelligent, smart, nice guy who helped me out a lot. And I was surprised to hear how smart he was. He had an interesting life after he worked with Doris. But he's not funny. The stuff is not funny. No. But Doris's ex-husband's nephew, who plays the janitor, Manuel, who's supposed to be like Hispanic, like Puerto Rican, but who's actually played by a Jewish guy. He's really funny, and he never did any comedy in his whole life. All of these reversals and ironies make the film really interesting to me and really funny. And by the way, Philip Stahl, who plays Manuel, died many years ago, but I tracked down his nephew and his son, and we've documented they shot scenes in his house. He's also in Deadly Weapons. He plays Crystal's father in Deadly Weapons.
Oh, okay.
Right. So he's an interesting guy, and he was Doris's. It was her husband at the time, her second husband, her husband's cousin. So he was just appropriated from the family. Like, can you work on this film? But he turns out to be kind of wonderful. So anyway,
that's amazing.
I actually remember what your question was, Jose. When Doris was working with Sammy Petrillo on this film, he mentioned that he had worked in a club or a burlesque house or something. I think it was in the Pittsburgh area, with a guy who was managing this new strip act by this woman with this huge chest, who they were calling Zsa Zsa at the time, because they thought she had an accent like Zsa Zsa Gabor. Although Chesty actually was born in Poland. She's a Polish Jew, and so she does have an accent. It's not the same as a Hungarian accent, but anyway, they were calling her Zsa Zsa, but she very quickly was dubbed Chesty Morgan. Doesn't have any relationship to her real name. And Sammy mentioned this guy to Doris, and Doris was talking on the phone with this agent, and got the idea. She wasn't a dummy, that she could make a noteworthy film with this woman, who, by the way, literally just started her career kind of like that year. Just was really new on the scene. So Doris was, had a prescient sense that this was going to be a big deal. And also she thought, in this world, which was turning into porno very quickly, if she could work with somebody, right, who had this tremendous natural bosom, was the word Doris used to use.
Right.
Supposedly, Chesty, whose name is Lillian, or at least has been known as Lillian most of her life. It's not her birth name, but it's been called Lillian most of her life. She has supposedly a 73-inch chest measurement, and it's all natural, no implants or anything like that. So Doris thought, gee, that will be a great gimmick, as Doris was saying. And Doris was absolutely right. So that film, Deadly Weapons, which had a very professional distribution, probably made more money than any other Doris Wishman movie ever made, and played all over the world. But Doris sold the rights to exploit that film, as they call it, outright. So she only received a flat fee up front, which she said, I don't know the figure and I don't have the contract. What she said was it was a great deal of money. One of the people involved in the deal I interviewed years ago came up with a figure. He said he wasn't sure if that was the right figure, but I'll report it in my book. Just people can decide but Doris said it was a lot of money. And then of course she was angry when she figured out that it was making hundreds of thousands of dollars around the world, and she wasn't getting a penny of it.
Oh man.
Awful.
Yeah.
But when the rights to the film reverted back to her and videotape came along, the Chesty films were the first films that she took to a little video distributor to try to get them distributed on video, because she understood and they understood they still had commercial value. And to this day, most people who've heard of Doris probably know the Chesty Morgan films before anything else. Does that make sense to you?
Oh, absolutely. And I know there was some talk of making a third movie that turned into Immoral 3, which, by the way, Immoral 3 is my favorite Doris movie. I think the girls are great in that. So
yes, they are. I've had a hard time finding out much about any of them, although I do know some things. I know some real names, but I think I tracked down one of them some years ago, but she sort of declined to respond, which happens sometimes, and I try to respect people's privacy. I think it's important to document this history, but I'm not trying to out people. I think it's unnecessary to feel embarrassed. 50 years, almost 50 years after you made some little film.
Right.
But I don't hassle people. But I'm sorry to say, I wish I knew more about those gals. I do know that Bunny Yeager and her husband did help Doris put that movie together. Bunny Yeager, a very famous cheesecake photographer, going back to the 50s. Very, very famous, very prolific, very well respected. Sold tons of stuff to Playboy and all those men's magazines in the 50s and 60s. She was sort of Doris's impromptu casting director for the Nudist films.
Gotcha.
She almost certainly referred all of the girls to Doris. There are a couple of exceptions, like Blaze Starr came from outside. But she almost certainly referred all the background actresses to Doris. They were all people who posed for her. I know from Bunny Yeager's archive, we know more about the names of the women and stuff. There are lots of pictures of them in Bunny's archive. But Bunny Yeager helped her put that film together. But you're right, the girls are interesting. The one young woman, the redhead, they were all New York, they were all Miami based at that time. That film was shot in Miami. Doris went back to Miami to film it. She hadn't done that since she made the Nudist films, if I'm not mistaken. But the one girl, she brought her up to New York to shoot some stuff up here and took her to Vegas with her and stuff like that. But I'm glad you're interested in that film. And it's supposed to be the third Chesty Morgan film.
Right.
Doris, I don't have the contract, but Doris said she had a contract to make 3 films with Chesty. And after the second one, she called it quits because Doris and Chesty had a very
contentious
relationship, a lot of tension, contentious.
Yeah.
And I think both of them were to blame. Both of them brought things to the table. They couldn't get along. And so even though Doris, must have seen the value of Chesty Morgan films, she called it quits. And so the Immoral Three was supposed to be the daughters of Mata Hari or something. And Chesty Morgan, they were the daughters of Chesty Morgan.
Right.
That was as close as she could get to Chesty Morgan.
Well, I think it's a pretty dang good movie. All right, we're sort of going a little over, and I don't want to keep you too long.
We've done a couple hours, and I don't know what the timeline is, but I can hang a little longer if you have other questions. I'm sure my answers were too long-winded, but I hope you're finding it interesting.
No, absolutely. There's 2 movies you wanted, 2 more movies to talk about, so we'll do those real quick, and then we'll answer a few more questions, and then we'll wrap it up.
Sure.
Let's talk about Let Me Die a Woman, which I think is probably her most exploitative movie ever. I'm curious how this got made.
And what do you mean by exploitative? I can ask you why you said that.
Well, to me, I hadn't seen it until I saw it in the Blu-ray set because it's one of those I don't know that so I wasn't ready for it, and I'm like, I don't know if it's Doris just using, and I don't want to speak ill.
I understand.
You know what I mean? But is she using these people to make a quick buck, or does she really care about these people and she's trying to destigmatize?
It's a great question and a very appropriate question. The answer is that Doris certainly wanted to make a movie that would make some money. Again, she was a commercial filmmaker, and she needed, just to keep herself in business, she needed to see some return on her investment in these films. So she wanted the film to make money, and she knew that a film that dealt with what they called transsexuals at the time. We use slightly different language these days, but there was a whole thing in the late 60s, early 70s about transsexualism. That was a cultural thing, and that wasn't the first time it had reared its head, right? With Christine Jorgensen. In the 50s, there had been a whole thing that went around the culture about whether a person, and Ed Woods, Glenn or Glenda is part of it. Right. So let's say that we're living through another reiteration of this whole culture of transgender, transsexualism now, and it might be called the third wave of that stuff for people who know the history. So Doris was aware of the fact that there was an interest in and a kind of a movement around regendering oneself in the early 70s, because she was friends with a woman named Zelda Suplee, who Doris knew because Zelda Suplee owned a couple of the nudist camps where Doris shot nudist films, because Zelda had started off in life as the queen of the nudists.
Okay.
In the 1950s, she was a big advocate for nudism and also owned nudist camps like Sunny Palms Lodge down in Florida, where Doris shot a couple of her films, and also owned or was partners in these nudist camps in New Jersey and in Pennsylvania. So Doris became friends with Zelda because she was, in a sense, partnering with Zelda to make nudist films. Mm-hmm. Zelda was letting her shoot, like Diary of a Nudist, letting her shoot in the nudist camps. And Zelda is in Diary of a Nudist. If you want to see who Zelda Suplee was, go watch Diary of a Nudist. The Blu-ray for it has not been released yet, right? Because the nudist films haven't come out yet.
Not yet, yeah.
They'll be out in some months or something, and then you can go see her. Zelda, somehow or other, in the late 60s, met people involved with the transsexual movement, and she became the head, the executive director of something that was called the Erickson Educational Foundation. It was founded by a very wealthy female to male transsexual. We won't get into the organization in too much detail, right? But there was very wealthy and founded this kind of think tank to help disseminate information about what this phenomenon was and about the integrity of transgender identity and that kind of stuff. Zelda became the director. Zelda was, outside of nudism, she was also into a psychic experience and all sorts, psychedelic experience, all sorts of interesting countercultural things. And this was a very countercultural thing at the time. So Zelda lived in New York, by the way, as Doris did, and they kept in touch. And Doris certainly became aware of the fact that Zelda was now directing this organization. And she thought, oh, this would be a pretty cool idea. So it was Zelda and the people she worked with who personally introduced her to Leo Wollman, who was this kind of go-to doctor who worked with transgendered people at that time, although more in the capacity of giving them hormone shots and of doing a certain type of group psychotherapy with them than in doing the surgery. He didn't do the surgery. He was a gynecologist by training, but he didn't do the surgery.
Okay.
And so Zelda introduced Doris to Leo Wollman, and he introduced, and also to other people in the New York transsexual community at that time, people who had actually transitioned or people who were transitioning. Mm-hmm. And Doris got to meet them. And the truth is, as Doris told me, she got to like these people. You know, she thought they were interesting people. She also said she felt kind of bad for them because a lot of them were poor and were trying to do something that was very difficult and expensive. So she told me right off the bat, and I don't think she had any sense that anyone would criticize her for this film. I don't really think she thought anyone would ever think she was exploiting them. I understand why you asked that question, Jose, but I don't think it ever occurred to Doris. But she told me right off the bat that she paid them more than she tended to pay typical actors because she felt bad for them because they really needed money and they were very nice and were willing to work with her. So the answer to your question is kind of, yes, Doris was trying to make a movie that would make some money. But no, she wasn't thinking, oh, this is like a freak show. Let me just make a movie about these oddballs. She wasn't thinking that at all. In fact, now there were a couple of different iterations of this film, which I won't talk about, but Doris actually made the film in the early 70s. But the version that we all know and love really wasn't completed until the later 70s. And the film went through a couple of different iterations. It was actually released in the early 70s under a different title. And then she went back and shot footage with this woman, Leslie, not her real name, but who winds up being the principal interview figure in the version of the film that everybody knows, right?
Yeah.
Last year I was a man, right? That famous quote, and that's in the trailer as well, right? I, by the way, knew Leslie fairly well when I first came to New York. I haven't spoken with her in a number of years, but hung out with her, interviewed her, or whatever. Really amazing, hysterically funny, nice, interesting, really great person. So Doris was involved with these people and befriended them, and she really liked Leslie. In fact, Doris's niece, not her niece Judy Kushner, but another niece who worked with her on the Chesty Morgan films, who was a professional makeup artist, not only became friends with Leslie, but helped to get her a job working in network television doing makeup and stuff. So Doris didn't think, oh, these people are just something I can make money with.
Okay.
She dealt with them like regular people who were unusual, but like regular people that she and her family became friends with and all that kind of stuff. So I hope that answers your question.
It does.
I don't, the film certainly, over time, different issues are treated in different ways, and sometimes we develop different rhetoric and different language to talk about them. Sometimes people get a little prickly if you use the language from the previous iteration, whatnot. I don't want to wade into those waters. I will say that given my sensibilities and my knowledge of Doris's attitudes, that Doris meant for the film to be a completely sincere documentary work about these people's lives. Now, there's another reason why some people say, oh, it's exploitative, because Doris actually scripted scenes and has some of these people actually act out scenes. Also, she used some actual actors, right? Like Harry Reams and the I'm not remembering her stage name right now because I know her real name so well. Another actress who was not transgendered, who is, as they say now, a cis woman, biologically born with female genitals, etc. Right? She actually used these people in scenes where it's supposed to be that they're transgendered, but they're not real. So some people think again, oh, here's Doris kind of like playing fast and loose. But Doris also had a very loose sense of what a documentary was. Like from Doris's point of view, docudrama was perfectly legitimate. If you're trying to show the attitudes of people and you scripted the scene, that was as good as a documentary from Doris's point of view. So, the people who hung out in the direct cinema movement, cinema verite movement, would have been, hey, Doris, we need to have a talk with you, right? But
right.
Doris didn't think there was anything wrong as long as you were depicting what she considered to be historically real events.
Okay.
It was okay to use actors to depict them. Doris didn't think, oh, I'm cheating here, in other words. So there are all kinds of reasons why people criticize Let Me Die a Woman. But I will say this too, 20 years ago, I did interact with some people in the transgender community, even some activists from that time. And they were very interested in the film. Very interested. And in Doris's motivation for making it, and in the fact that it actually is the only documentary record we have of quite a few actual transgendered and transgendering people from that time. So I think, the transgender community does owe Doris a certain a debt for having actually taken the time to record certain things that would be lost to history if Doris hadn't made that film. Yeah? Okay.
Got it.
I hope that helps. Other questions?
Absolutely. Let's talk about the last movie on the list here. And even though it's our last, it's her first horror movie, A Night to Dismember. Now, there's a whole bunch of history about this movie, so let's get into it.
And something that would obviously interest you, given your own interest as a filmmaker, Jose. Doris, was pretty married to the genres she worked in, largely because she knew that she could pay the bills with them. And again, I know somebody could take that statement and make it sound like, cheap in some way. But, if you've got something going and you are paying your own rent, you probably don't want to mess with it too much. Yeah?
Right.
There are a lot of people, there are a lot of Hollywood B-movie directors who worked in film noir or in Westerns. And I never heard anybody criticize those people for sticking with the same genre, Fritz Lang, what a crappy filmmaker. He only makes film noir. Again, I'm willing to engage people in these discussions. There are nuances and I don't want to throw the baby out the bath. There are nuances that I understand and respect. But just because you worked in a genre doesn't mean you're a bad filmmaker or that you're a lesser filmmaker. And particularly if you were independent and paying your bills. So Doris had worked in sex films. That's where she made a home for herself and made a business for herself. And branching out of that genre was not easy. First of all, hardly anybody who worked in low budget ever got a chance to work in Hollywood. Very rare. And if you worked in sex films, Hollywood producers almost certainly did not want to talk to you.
Yeah.
I've always felt bad for Gerard Damiano because he tried so hard to make very, very, very well-crafted, intelligent porno films, and he sincerely believed, and I was lucky to be able to interview him a few times as well years ago. He sincerely believed that he would be taken seriously by the serious filmmaking community and maybe even morph into becoming a Hollywood filmmaker. Hollywood played a dirty trick on him. Yeah, they went to see Deep Throat because they wanted to see a dirty movie, but they were not going to give him a job. They were not going to go that way. So there was a stigma associated with it, right? So it wasn't easy for Doris to move out of that genre. But starting in the later 70s, as historians of horror films know, the horror films sort of got a new lease on life, right? The Friday the 13th and Halloween kind of franchises kind of helped to revive the horror genre, which at least in America had lost a lot of steam. You had, Italian filmmakers doing some amazing things, right?
Yeah,
but in
yeah.
America, horror movies were kind of like Frankenstein and the Mummy to most people, right? And science fiction kind of took over in the 50s. And horror movies, it was kind of a vague part of the business, I would say, until it really was reborn heavy duty with these kind of films in the later 70s, early 80s.
Yeah.
So Doris must have been aware of that fact, that, low-budget horror movies were kind of like rearing their head. And the dirty secret is that if you worked in porno, at least in New York, you could kind of quietly transition into horror movies because it wasn't considered a reputable genre. So you didn't have to have a good reputation. At least, it was okay if you made porno. People like Roberta Findlay tried to go into horror. And other people who shot porno in New York snuck into horror. You could do it. People didn't look down at you. They didn't say, get off my set. You made porno.
Right.
So Doris probably recognized you could make a reasonably cheap movie and that she probably wouldn't be snubbed if she tried to work her way into it. Also, if you look at her porno films, Satan Was a Lady and Come With Me, My Love, they're supernatural films that start to feel like horror films. She's already, I think, thinking in this direction. At the very least, they're serious supernatural films. And again, I'll let people like you debate, what the line is between supernatural and horror and gore and that stuff. But a certain level where they all kind of hang together. So Doris was already sort of tending in that direction. And in fact, I think that the third lost porno that I'm pretty sure she was shooting, at least, I think that was meant to be a horror film based on stuff I have from her archive.
Wow.
Annie Sprinkle, who stars in Satan Was a Lady, said famously years ago, Doris Wishman was a lady who wanted to make a horror movie, but she only had enough Doris Wishman was a lady who wanted to make a horror movie, but she only had enough money to make a porno movie. Annie, who was just starting her very long, and successful career at that time. In fact, Satan Was a Lady, Annie said, it was the first porno she ever made where she actually had dialogue that she was supposed to remember. Like she had sort of made loops and these kind of 16 millimeter shot from the hip features before that. So she was like, Doris was the first person I worked with who really acted like a director and expected me to do certain things like an actress, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But Annie's perception was that Doris was making a kind of a horror movie with porno elements. So Doris was already maybe heading that way when she got the idea to make A Night to Dismember. Now, A Night to Dismember had a very, very long and in many ways unhappy history. It took Doris years and years to finish, and probably the reason was because, in fact, it is harder to make a horror movie than a porno movie, as you know. Special effects particularly are a pain in the ass. I mean, it might be problematic to get, a guy to get an erection on cue for your porno movie.
Right.
But, it's not as hard as making sure that squibs and blood sacs and prosthetic limbs and things actually look good and work.
Right.
It's not that hard. So Doris, I think, learned the hard way that it was harder to make a horror movie than it was to make a porno movie. Just because the production elements are more complicated and you need to be more organized.
Mm-hmm.
You really have to know what you're going to shoot tomorrow when you're shooting a horror movie with effects. You can't just have people show up and wing it, right?
Yeah, no.
So I think Doris learned the hard way. Also, though, I think there were money problems for Doris at that stage in her career and in her life. She just couldn't keep the money flowing. She had, made money and lost money, never made a lot of money, never lost a lot of money. But I just think she was not thriving. The films she made at that time didn't pay much. She was borrowing money from people. She was trying to find a backer. And I think she found one, and I think she actually lost control of the film at some point. These are reasonable speculations that I'll flesh out more in my book. But the production from a money point of view also was falling apart all over the place. She'd shoot for a few days, and then she couldn't do anything for a year, and then she'd come back and try to get people to come back to shoot. I know one fellow who worked on A Night to Dismember quite well. He had actually been an assistant editor who worked at the editing house where she always worked, and she kind of impressed him into where he was a young guy. Hey, you want to be in the movie? He was a young guy, so he was dumb enough to say yes. She shot some scenes with him, and then she calls him back a couple years later and says, "Can I get you to come back? I got to finish these scenes." He said, "Doris, wait a minute. I mean, I'm a couple years older. My hairstyle's totally different. I don't think it'll match." She said, "Don't worry about it. Do you still have that shirt you were wearing when we shot that scene?" And, he shows up and he puts on that shirt, and lo and behold, you don't actually necessarily notice that he actually has different hair, Doris was pretty smart about certain things, right?
Oh, that's funny.
So that film, I used to say that film is kind of like a version of Frankenstein, although it's not about Frankenstein's monster. It is Frankenstein's monster because it's cobbled together from bits and pieces of all the stuff she shot over the years. And also, there are actually two different versions of that film.
Right.
There's a whole separate version of that film that predates it. It was meant to be the film and exists in this kind of semi-lost version that I've only been... Chuck Smith actually had the only known copy on videotape, although I later found a guy who did work as an editor on that film who claimed that he believed there was a transfer somewhere, which he never produced for me, like a 1-inch transfer. But there are two different versions of that film. And then I actually acquired all of these 35 millimeter elements from A Night to Dismember. And I won't go into detail, but they were sold to somebody who may or may not do something with them someday. It's not the complete film as far as I could tell at all, but there are big chunks there. And so there's the possibility that there are elements for a third version of the film if somebody ever wants to take the time to put it together.
Wow.
Right? I'll never know the whole story, but from what I've been able to piece together, it was just too big and complicated for Doris to pull together. And particularly at that point in her career, she was getting older. She just didn't have the money anymore. The industry was changing like crazy. She just couldn't hold it together. But to her credit, she worked and worked and worked and worked and worked until that film was completed. And so the version of it that people know that was released on videotape years ago, they probably sold 18 copies of it. They're very rare.
I got one.
Oh, you have the original videotape?
Well, not the videotape, but I've got it on DVD from.
Oh, sure.
I don't know who put it out, but I got that. She signed it for me too.
Right, Elite. Was that the company? Yeah,
something like that. Image or something. Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful that they put that out. I mean, it's so great that it exists. It is one of the most fascinating films I've ever seen. And I've shown it a few times to very advanced cinema studies students. I mean, some people would say, ha ha, advanced, but literally, it takes people with a pretty strong sensibility for film form to watch that film and to understand its bizarre complexity. I mean, there are moments in that film where there are two separate soundtracks laid one over the other. I mean, it's literally a Frankenstein's monster sewed together from not just like a normal movie's a Frankenstein's monster. I mean, all movies are Frankenstein's monster, all these shots edited together. Literally put together from all these disparate elements that were never intended to have anything to do with one another. And then crazy soundtrack. I mean, it's insane and brilliant and frankly beautiful. It's one of those rare works of what I call organic surrealism. Not created by some intellectual, like Marcel Duchamp or something, who's self-consciously thinking about this kind of strange code, and it's all secret code, but they know what it all means.
Right.
A Night to Dismember works as a work of surrealism. It's like you're in some terrible nightmare, right? But Doris, there's nothing to decode. Doris isn't trying to share some secret with you that you have to figure out. It's literally a hodgepodge of stuff that winds up hanging together as a kind of very trippy, surreal experience. And I think it's a really profound film. Again, for people who don't need for there to be a text, meaning there doesn't need to be a theory that explains the, quote, meaning of the film, who can just float with images, sounds, images, and walk through the psychedelic landscape. I think it's a brilliant experience, and it's really a great movie.
It's definitely really fun, and I've actually seen that other cut at Chuck's house. I don't remember it too well, but I know I've seen it, and
it hangs together a little bit better, but it's not entirely different. And Chuck shared it with me years ago, so I have a bad, video dub of what he shared with me, and it's if there were any way to, I mean, I think the original elements are long gone, but that doesn't mean they totally disappeared. I mean, things turn up. But just having that video cassette residue, I mean, it is the film. It's just poor quality to look at. But we can see the film and see what was there. And that was the original version. Wow. That was the original version of the film.
Yeah.
And the one that we have is actually what Doris struggled to put together out of what was supposed to be outtakes. Literally. Because I think, based on what some hints she gave me and other things that I heard, I think that she actually lost control of the film to a backer, and they literally took the original film, and probably freaked out when they saw it because it's a total disaster. Right? And then she made a film that's twice as much of a disaster, but is even twice as brilliant because of it. So I don't know if you have other questions about it, but she worked with a guy too. Who won under the name of Les Lorraine, who supposedly did the effects. And I found some reference to the fact that it's a real guy who really existed and who died very young. Oh. But it does seem like he was a guy who was trying to style himself as a guy who really did gore effects at a pretty early time in the history of that profession.
Right.
So I think there's some more to find out about that guy, and I would love to find out more about him. I'm not a specialist in horror movies, so I think some people in that world, better than I may know some things about him. But I've seen references to him within the context of people who know gore and horror films, and he was a real guy. And how he would have crossed Doris's path, I'll never know. But I also know some people who acted with her and who worked on sound and who edited. I mean, I know quite a bit about the post-production. But that guy, because he did apparently die very young, is sort of a mystery.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, one of the many mysteries.
For horror people, he would be an important guy to know more about, right?
Absolutely. I'll have to look at. I'll track his name down and I'll mention it to a couple of people, see if they come across it.
We can talk about it at another time.
All right. Before we wind it up, we got a couple questions here from the chat. The monkey asks a question for your guest. What is your favorite poster you own from the films you've written about?
Meaning Doris's films.
Yeah, let's go with Doris's films.
With Doris's films, because I do work on some other people's careers as well. My favorite poster. I hadn't thought about that, so let me. I probably am not going to name one poster.
Okay, name a couple.
Some of the Nudist films are fun. Most of Doris's artwork was done by a company run by a man named ONLΔP, who did press books and posters for most of the low-budget independents, but not just exploitation.
Yeah.
I mean, he was doing early Stanley Kubrick films, and he did almost all of the, low-budget, anything independent in New York.
Wow.
Velde tended to do. Now, Velde didn't do the artwork. He hired different graphic artists. And I've had limited luck finding out much about the graphic artist, but I think, a lot of it was kind of cut and paste work. I think the Nudist films are pretty colorful, and I do like most of them. Hot Out in the Sun, the first one, is not my favorite. Velde didn't do that. But A Diary of a Nudist and Gentlemen Prefer Nature Girls and Blaze Stargo's Nudist, The Prince and the Nature Girl, her last one, I think those are all really fun posters. In terms of the sexploitation films, let's see. I think A Taste of Flesh is kind of a clean-looking poster. The sexploitation posters tended to be as kind of gritty and lurid as the films, and they're not always great from a graphic art point of view. Now I'm putting on the hat of some guy who can judge good graphic art, so I don't think they're super poster. The Bad Girls poster is a very strange, unusual poster. That genre. It's almost not really a poster. It's very expensive if anyone has one. Yeah, it doesn't have the classic structure of a poster.
It's like a book cover.
Yeah, it doesn't really hang as a poster entirely. It's not a horrible image. Indecent Desires, again, Too Much Too Often. They're not all my favorite. When it comes to sexploitation posters, I really like the posters for the films distributed by William Mishkin, which are full of all of these stills and all these taglines. See the shocking images. I really like those. Those seem to embody the sensibility of sexploitation. Right. So I don't know if any of the why do I keep saying blaxploitation? I'm getting tired. Any of the sexploitation period posters are favorites of mine.
Gotcha.
And then later on, let's see. It gets kind of chaotic later. I mean, I have a lot of the stuff. I guess having surveyed it, I would say that from the point of view of classical poster collecting and classical poster graphics, the Nudist film posters are the most successful and the most fun.
Okay. Fantastic. Okay, last question we're going to go to Montag the Magician asks, how do we get a copy of your book? Now, you've talked about this, so maybe just reiterate what the plan is.
Yeah, this has literally been a project that's gone on for something crazy like 25 years for me. And in a sense, there's no excuse for that. Like, there were many junctures when it should have been done. And my only excuse, so to speak, is that my life has shifted and morphed in many ways over the past 25 years. And I've been doing other things in tandem. I also never felt any real need to rush a book out. Like, there was no contract, there was no deadline, there was no event that made me say, oh yeah, this really has to get out in 6 months if it's going to make any money or something like that, you know. But having said that, probably if I were more centered as a writer researcher, I would have finished it earlier. I will say though that the fact that it's dragged on for years has been very beneficial in a couple of ways. First of all, it was very, very difficult to research Doris's career, even though I had her technical cooperation in those years when I knew her and hung out with her. You know, she was famous for kind of obfuscating and obscuring certain facts and outright lying a few times, which I don't criticize her for. I don't mean to denigrate her. It's like she was embarrassed or she wanted to tell something, so she just lied. Hey, I've lied to people too, right? So I'm not judging her. I figured out pretty quickly that she was lying, though, so I think I know what the real story is in those cases. Like about the porno films. Michael, I didn't make any porno, so she lied to my face, right? But even though I had Doris's cooperation, the truth is it's been very, very difficult to research her career. There was no file cabinet full of stuff documenting Doris's career. Newspapers didn't review her movies. You know, there was almost no paper trail.
Right.
So I've had to cobble this together from lots of different interviews. I mean, I started reaching out to and finding people and the internet. I started this before there was an effective internet. I was going to the library looking for people's phone numbers in old phone books, okay?
Wow.
This is, to younger people, this will sound like ancient history. I may not look that old, but I'm pushing 60. So I was doing this under a whole different research regime. Newspapers. I was going blind trying to find microfilm. There were no digitized databases you could access online. And calling people, etc. So even sharing the movies with people. I was dubbing videotapes and mailing them to people, hoping that when they saw this stupid movie they were in 40 years ago, they would remember some things, right?
Right, jog the memory, yeah.
Right. There was none of this, I'll upload it to my Google Drive if you want to watch it now, right? None of that existed. I'm delighted that all of that exists now. I'm not trying to make the past sound like it was better. It wasn't. It was hard. So all sorts of new research tools have come into being, and also I've stumbled onto and found all sorts of people and resources that didn't exist when Doris was alive, or even in the first several years of my efforts to write the book. So I'm really glad it's taken this long, because the book will be that much better because I'm constantly updating things. In fact, as we're speaking right now, I'm processing an archive full of papers from the estate of this guy who shot most of Doris's nudist films, who, unlike Doris, saved everything. And generously, the heirs to his estate let me go in, and I saved a couple of films that he made, but also looked for stuff relative to Doris's career. So I had to wade through this house that was like a hoarder's house. There was so much junk in it. But I found wonderful things. Well, those things, I've had them for some years now, but they've been in storage for a while, and I finally got to a point where I'm now wading through them and finding wonderful things. Like, for instance, it turns out that he edited, not just shot, but edited Nude on the Moon. And I have the actual continuity script with all of his editing choices, right, in that script. And also contracts and letters and other things that help me better document Doris's career. So even right up to today, I'm still processing stuff that will help my book become a better document of the truth of Doris's career. Having said that, I'm really close to the point where the book can and should be done. I have a large part of the manuscript completed. I had expected to have it published by this point, but late in life, I had a kid, my son, who's the light of my life. And the past year, I spent most of my time looking after him. He's just a little guy, and he just started school. And with everything going on in New York City the past few years, it was my responsibility to spend most of my time raising him. So he's now in school, and I have a lot more free time. and I can finally get the book project together. And I really want to get it together. I feel like it's time to get it done. So in answer to the question, my book should be available sometime next year. It'll certainly be, the writing and all that stuff will be done, early next year. And I decided several years ago to publish it myself. There are people who told me that was a mistake, but I'd like to maintain control over that aspect of the project. I don't really see the reason to share the revenues with everybody, although people in publishing say, oh, we'll make a lot more money for you. I don't know. From what I've learned over the years, getting 5 cents on the dollar doesn't sound like a great deal to me. But also, I'm looking for a new career at this late phase in my life. I worked for many years teaching on the college level, but I've left that, and I'd like to become a publisher. So
Great.
What better way to start my publishing company than to publish a couple of my own books, right? So my press is called Retrographica, a name I came up with years ago, and I decided to stick with. I just kind of like it. And I have a couple of talented graphic artists I work with to put together the graphic elements. And hopefully my writing will turn out to be clean and intelligible and accurate. So look for it, say like the middle of next year, and I'll do what I can using existing social media and the networks for these kind of films that exist to get the word out. And maybe my buddies at Something Weird and Ag fucking help me get the word out when it's out there, that kind of stuff. And you'll find it. I'll do my best to make people know it's available.
Yeah.
So keep your ears out, and maybe I'll get a website together sooner than later, for the publishing company, so people can have some way of figuring it out. But I'm on Facebook and whatnot if people want to connect with me there.
Absolutely. And I will let the world know once that's out, and I will be the first person placing an order.
I think there's enough of a network of people who appreciate Doris that we can lay the foundation with that. And if the book itself has any merit to people in the larger cinephile world, and I know how to reach some of those people too. I'll try to get review copies out and stuff like that, but I'll let it speak for itself.
Yeah.
If it's just me mailing copies out to people for 5 years, that's fine. As long as they can afford to pay a normal price for the book, it'll keep me going and help start my publishing. So
I
anyway,
love it.
I would like to do maybe some website-based interface where I can also share additional artifacts and things. It can be fairly expensive to photograph posters and things like that, and there could be some rights issues relative to a few of the photos I have, although I would say very few. But I would love to be able to maybe create a website as a kind of a sidebar. It has more graphics and stuff. Like all my posters I've had professionally photographed and things. It would be a great way to share them in full color and high res and stuff with people. So I may do something like that on the side. I'm not really savvy when it comes to building websites, and I haven't completely found a partner for that yet, but maybe I will sooner than later, and then we'll get a decent looking website for the fans out there.
Amazing.
I will say one thing, a little teaser. And again, another of the reasons why I'm glad I didn't publish this book 10 years ago. Only a couple of years ago, the son of a woman who was one of Doris's best friends in the 1940s very generously gave me photos from his mother's estate of Doris in the 1940s.
Wow.
So I will make those, I will make something from that available in my book, but it would be great to have an interface where I could share more of them.
Yeah.
But I think people would be really delighted to see those pictures. Doris had very few photos of herself from when she was young. And she had a flood in her apartment while I knew her. It destroyed some of the stuff she had. The apartment above, a pipe broke and water rained down into her apartment. And I literally found the damage. I have some of the damaged remnants of that episode, so she wasn't lying. It really happened.
Wow.
So she lost personal photos and stuff like that. But I have some goodies that she let me. One other thing I'll say. In the days before scanning, at least, I don't know, you probably had to be NASA or IBM to have a scanner when I started this, right? I had a professional photographer, re-photograph photos that Doris had for me.
Wow.
Re-photograph them professionally so that I'd have negatives of them. But I do have some I do have some other, incredibly rare and interesting pictures of Doris earlier in her life with her first husband, things like that. So I will make every effort to make as much of that available in the book as possible. But I'd like them to be good quality images. And, halftones these days, particularly in digitally printed books, are not very good.
Yeah.
I'm discouraged to see how weak they are. So I may try to create another interface that will give people a chance to see good quality images. I mean, my God, we have the internet and you can see high quality digital images now. I'd hate to just put out these kind of muddy, digitally printed photos that and it can be quite expensive, as you know, to produce color photos for a book. Maybe prohibitively expensive. But anyway, We'll figure it out. So I hope that answers the question. I'm glad you're interested in the book. It'll be a very fact-oriented book. I try not to have a strong voice as an author. I want it to be about Doris and her films and all the little trivia. But if anybody has heard any of the commentary tracks I've done so far, or the AGFA releases, that'll give you a taste of what the book will be like. I love all the little trivia, all the little factoids, all the little connections. Anything I can document, I'll try to throw in the book.
Yeah, those commentaries have been great. I've been watching those and just soaking up all. I mean, there's so many facts in there; it's hard to soak it all up. But that's what makes it re-listenable and rewatchable.
I'm glad you enjoy it. And again, I sort of don't know what else to do. That's how I work. I mean, I have theories, and I could talk at some length about why I think Doris's films are important and beautiful and interesting as art. But I think the most solid thing I can do for people is give them the information about how they were made. And then if they want to use that as the basis for making arguments about why Doris's films are good or bad, I'll leave it up to them. I have a pretty strong academic background, right, which means I spent too much time in college. And a great deal of what people do in college is, quote, theorize about things. And I can theorize with the best of them, but I realized a long time ago that a lot of these academic theories are kind of bullshit. They're oftentimes whipped off without without a profound, detailed understanding of how the artwork was made, for instance. And I think it's important that we come to grips with, we come to terms with the real process the artist went through to make a thing before we come up with grand theories about what it means or why it's important as art.
Right.
You're a filmmaker yourself, Jose. You know that many good things that are in your films are the byproduct of total accidents.
Absolutely, yeah.
And thank God they happened, right?
Yep.
And one of the great things about photography and about the cinema as an outgrowth of photography is that it can capture and preserve accidents.
Yeah.
Things that never happened before and will never happen again.
Yeah.
Even as you know, directing actors, just that little something special that an actor said or did in a moment that they can't even do again.
Right.
But you have a record of it. And it's gold, right? So knowing how the films were made is the first thing I think anybody should do. In fact, you have a responsibility to do before you start to say, this is what this movie means, or what, I used to make fun of my students hopefully in a gentle and a pedagogically effective way for talking about symbolism. They say, why do you think the character is wearing like red shoes? And I'd say probably because the director told them to show up wearing anything they had, and they showed up wearing red shoes, right? I mean, one of the great powers of the cinema is that it captures wonderful accidents. Not that these total geniuses who planned everything out in advance make movies, right? That's one of my, and I think directors are people who have a talent for seeing that special moment when it happens and saying, that's the take I'm going to use.
Oh, yeah.
That's when the magic happened. And I couldn't have planned this in a million years. But thank God I saw it. I think a good director is a real seer. They see what's happening. They watch, and they go, yep. And you know what? Doris she could see what was going on. I learned that from working on that movie we worked on with her. She knew when a take was good and when it was bad.
Yeah.
You didn't
Yeah.
always have money to go back and shoot 5 takes.
Right.
She knew. Anyway, that's
She
about
knew.
the book. Any other questions? We're getting to, I think, the 3-hour mark, so maybe you can chop this up into 3 hours and use them to. Any other final questions, Jose?
No, I think we're good, man. I think that's a perfect place to leave it. Doris knew she had that special something in her. Like you said, her movies are her movies. There's nothing like her cinema. And love it or hate it, it's better to have interesting films than to have disposable garbage. And luckily,
you're telling me.
Yeah, Doris will never be disposable because she is I'm not gonna say I wouldn't go so far as saying a genius, but I will say she is a cinema magician, and she knew what an audience would enjoy, and she knew what she wanted to see. And I think her illusion is beautiful, and I think it's gonna last forever.
I agree with you completely, and I'm glad you appreciate the work, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk about her films and give, both to share some facts, but also to share some of my sensibilities. It doesn't hurt that I knew her. I've always considered it to be a great gift that she befriended me, that we spent time together. My take on her work is constantly colored by my sense of who she was. Mm-hmm. So I'm not just working out of the archive, talking about somebody who died 100 years ago and trying to resurrect who they were based on paper documents. I can hear her voice. I have a sense of what she would and wouldn't do, and I'll try to incorporate that sense into the book as well. I don't know if I'm the right person to write a book that will make Doris come alive as a kind of a fictional character. Mm-hmm. A lot of biographers try to make the subject of their book come alive as a person. I'm not sure if that's my talent or my desire, but I think that I can explain how the films were made, and I'll do my best to at least represent my sense of who she was. And then, after that, well, who knows? Maybe somebody will see the merits, and I'll be able to peddle their book rights to make a biopic, and then somebody can figure out how to represent her in that respect. That would be fine with me.
Oh my gosh. Absolutely.
That would be fine. I mean, people have spoken with me about that in years past. In fact, I was even attached to a deal to try to do that. It didn't produce anything. And other people have, in fact, approached me about it. Doris is a very appealing person, particularly to play for an older actress to play. So I could certainly see. I can imagine two things. I can imagine a really terrible film, because most biopics are frankly really terrible.
Right.
It would try to reconstruct your life, but I can also imagine a very interesting, sensitive film that would maybe try to represent Doris, in a slightly more sophisticated way. Try to get into her head. And if that film would have to be made by a person who cared a lot about movies, because it would be a film about this lady who completely independently figured out a way to make crazy, wonderful movies, and so filmmaking would have to be part of it. Anyway,
yeah.
I'm glad people are still curious about her work. I'm delighted that AGFA saw the merits, not just to retransfer them, but to make these wonderful box sets.
Yeah.
That make her these important chunks in her career, accessible to Nudist films, the blaxploitation, and the kind of hodgepodge from her later career.
Yeah. And
I know they'll live on for a long time, and this iteration won't be the last time you'll hear from Doris. Something will happen again 20 years from now. God willing, I'll be around maybe to see it, and she'll live on. She'll always be marginal, but for people who understand and really know the story of the cinema, she'll be one of those delightfully important marginal figures that you feel lucky to know about. because she enriches the main narrative and makes it all that more complex and fun. So
absolutely.
Anyway, thanks for a chance to talk with your viewers and listeners, Jose.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, Mike. We've been planning this for a while, and I think it's sort of the right time, with the box sets coming out and everything. I appreciate you being here. Like I said, I consider myself very lucky to have been on that set and to have experienced not only making the movie, but getting to know her, getting to know you, getting to know Chuck. It was a great part of my life, and something I hold dear as a filmmaker, because you don't ever, you usually don't get to go on set of filmmakers that you like and see them work. Like, I'm not going to go hang out with John Carpenter and watch him make a movie or anything. That doesn't happen. So to be able to sit back and see like, oh, wow, okay, so this is how they used to make movies back then. And just kind of see her style. I loved it. I'll never forget it. And
you might consider, since you're skilled in this kind of vlogging kind of stuff, maybe you might consider sitting down yourself someday and sharing your own memories, as a vlog diary or something. Would be great. Anything that anybody can do to contribute to her story is valuable too, because again, you ain't gonna find major institutions making the effort. We're gonna carry the torch. So the people who were there, and you're the last. You're the last generation. There's nobody younger than you, and you're probably getting older, right? There's nobody younger than you who knew her. So you're the last generation who can speak about it, for personal experience. Yeah. Anyway,
I love it.
Anyway, take care.
Yes, let's call it a night. Michael, thank you. Everybody watching at home, thank you for watching. If you're watching this in the replay, if you have any questions for Michael, leave them in the comments. I can always email him, and I'll get back to you with his responses about all that. Once the book is out, you will hear it from me. I'm going to get a copy. I'm going to be the first person to buy it. I'm going to show it to you guys here, and I'll tell you where to get it. And Doris will live on. My reviews will continue. We still have, I'm assuming that the last box set's called the Sunlight Years. Is that what the idea is?
That's what I understand. Yeah, I've contributed commentary tracks, but I'm not intimately involved with producing, the actual hard goods, so to speak. So I'll leave that to the folks at AGFA. But I think that's what I remember. But regardless, it's a collection of her Nudist films. It should be out. Again, I don't even know the exact date. It's not my business, but in the next few months is my understanding. Yeah. Yeah. Soon enough. By the end of the year is what I understood.
Okay.
So and if you don't have the earlier boxes, the films are great. I've contributed a couple of commentaries to those two. I actually do two in the Nudist film box. I've been asked not to say what they are.
Okay.
But there is something in there that will surprise some people.
Okay.
And I think it's well worth checking out. And I'm grateful to everybody for supporting AGFA in this effort as well. I have absolutely no financial stake in that at all, but I'm just so grateful that they want to keep the memory alive and her work alive. And I'm grateful that they reached out to me to share my take on her films and help educate people about her. So anyway, buy the DVDs, guys. Or the
Blu-rays. Yes.
I'm trying to get hip to the new lingo. The Blu-rays.
There you go.
Okay.
And then maybe down the line we'll get a 4K. But all right, Michael, thank you so much. Have a good night.
Good night.
And we'll talk soon. Everybody home, love you. See you soon. Peace out for now.
Yeah. Y'all ready?